Convening our 40B case on 134 Babcock Street. Again, for the record, to my right is Kate Poverman, Jesse Geller, Mark Zuroff, Chris Hussey. Tonight's hearing, as with the prior hearings, is being tape recorded for a record. Court stenographer will not be here this evening, but my understanding is that we are being recorded here. We're being recorded live. And there will be a transcription off of the recorded tape. So I would ask people to forgive typographical errors, but we'll do the best we can. Since our last hearing, the applicant has provided us with an updated project plan. People will remember that at the last hearing, the ZBA outlined its view on ways in which this project fell short. And the applicant took the ZBA's words and it has come back with an altered proposal. I understand, Maria, that you are prepared to give us an update both in terms of administration as well as project and other outstanding issues.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Geller. Why don't we just start with a little bit of where we left off, the August 23rd, 2017 hearing. There were some outstanding materials that were asked of the applicant. One of them was your question regarding site control. There was a question raised about the deed for one of the parcels, that it had not been recorded prior to the purchase and sale. I did contact Mass Housing 3 times, and the first time I don't believe they correctly understood the question, and 2 subsequent emails and phone call they haven't responded to. So I did request something in writing regarding if that issue was an issue for site control. Now, I've discussed this with our 40B consultant, Judy Barrett, so if she will be here in probably about 5 minutes. So if we can return to that topic when she is here, I would appreciate that. In regard to what has transpired since the last hearing, at the August 23rd hearing, the ZBA did give the developer a charge, and I will just briefly summarize that here. All peer review testimony reinforces the ZBA's initial charge dated July 24, 2017. Agree with Cliff Bomer, that's the architectural peer reviewer's recommendations. Eliminate or reduce top floor, too tall and out of scale, incongruous with neighborhood, increase setbacks on all sides, maintain front yard setback modal pattern, move garage entrance to side yard, make less commercial, more residential, provide a residential entryway, improve the parking ratio, which is too low. The number of proposed units cannot be supported at the site, excessive massing, low parking supply. Concerned about lateral foundation support, provide more open space and landscape buffering. And then the peer review recommendations, which include traffic and parking, were not repeated, and it's understood that the applicant will respond. So what we focused on in the last few weeks was really the architectural. And we had 2 staff meetings that included the project team, staff, and Mr. Bomer, the architectural peer reviewer. One was on September 7th, the other on September 26th. Regarding the September 7th session, the project team was very well prepared, and they did come with revised plans that show a great deal was improved and was changed. Those improvements were regarding the architectural style, which is more in keeping with the structure next door, improving the parking ratio with stackers, and improving the site circulation by moving the garage entrance to the left and eliminating the loading zone. I will say that these issues regarding parking ratio and site circulation were not vetted with DPW or with traffic and parking because that it was too preliminary to do so. The largest feedback was really about that front yard setback. I'm not going to steal Mr. Boehmer's thunder, but there was concern about the front yard setback not being deep enough, as well as what more could be done to reduce the height. And one of the issues that we had asked the team to explore was, had they seriously thought about putting the parking subgrade? And that was the focus of the subsequent session on September 26th. Okay, that point, the front yard setback remained the same, and we did get a very satisfactory response into how much they had explored putting the parking subgrade. It turns out it wouldn't have been more than 4 to 6 feet, and it wouldn't have amounted to reducing the height substantially, nor would it have provided more parking. And Mr. Boehmer can address his response to that. The deficiencies, if we were to compare the volume of the initial proposal with the volume of the revised proposal, the step backs and the setbacks are not that great. There is some improvement at the top floor at the rear, but in terms of what the core of what the ZBA was asking for, the feeling was that more work needs to be done. Now, another thing that did hamper us quite a bit, is that we do not have topographical surveys of the properties abutting this site. This is important because there is some sharp declines that go beyond this site. So this site will be perceived as a story or so, we estimate. We would like to be more accurate so that we can investigate if the mitigation proposed is sufficient enough. Now, what does that require? That means that the applicant will need to ask permission, or may have already asked permission, to trespass on abutters' properties. I don't know if that permission has been granted or rebuffed, but I will tell you, we're pretty adamant about having accurate grading plans so that we can look at a 3D model that reflects accurate grading, and we can assess both impact and mitigation. So I would look to the ZBA to at least encourage the applicant to try again, and if there are abutters present, impress upon them how important it is to cooperate and provide access to the applicant's surveyor. I also want to point out that Mr. Boehmer's report this evening is not final. It is not a written report. As he will speak to this, the feeling at our last session was that more work did need to be done to reduce the massing, and we certainly hope that you will provide more instructions, and the response from the project team will be positive. Other things that, in terms of outstanding information, you'll recall that there is concern about the lateral support. So some exploration, some thought given to what foundation methods might be used. This is important to assess what the impact might be on abutters' properties, especially the trees that are on the abutters' properties that are very close to the property line. I also just want to reiterate again with the topography, this particular site does penetrate a two-family district. There really is no rear yard view. So we have Manchester and Stedman streets that are exposed, and therefore it really is important to us to have accurate grading rendered. Okay, if there's anything else, I do want to also say in the course of these iterative plans, there is a need to touch base with the Chief of Environmental Health regarding the trash plan. That is not a small thing, because we do need to understand site circulation in terms of how that will be managed, where receptacles would be put if there is an adequate number, which of course affects public health, and if it's going to be stored inside, as we hope, is there adequate storage space within the building footprint? I do trust that the applicant will provide it, has given that some thought. It's just a little early as the plans may not be firmed up yet. Also regarding stackers, we certainly did not have time for the peer reviewers to weigh in. There may be more changes to the plans, so that certainly would be the focus of the next public hearing. Also regarding site stopping distance and any changes to the traffic analysis would also need to be updated so that our peer reviewers and DPW have that information. One thing that I will also just let you know, per usual, the building commissioner, when plans get revised and firmed up, does request a preliminary building code analysis, and that will also be important here because of some concerns about the garage. We did ask for an extension to close the hearing to January 11th, 2018, and Mr. Engler actually considered that with the project team. We did get an extension to November 24th, 2017.
November what?
November 24th, 2017.
How close is that to Thanksgiving?
So what I'm looking at right now is the next hearing possibly being November 6th. That really does depend on what comes out of this particular session. Clearly, that is not enough time. I have done a schedule that's pretty detailed. That is pretty detailed. So November 24th, we still will need an extension beyond November 24th. I think Mr. Engler's rationale is to provide 30-day extensions as requested as needed. Okay. Okay. So what we'll hear tonight is Peter Bartash is the project team's architect. He will give an overview of the revised plans. I understand there was further tweaking of the grading and the 3D model. He'll speak to that, how that was done. That was something that we had not seen during the work sessions, but I understand the project team is diligent about resolving that issue. After that, Mr. Bomer will give his comments again. That is not a final report. It's preliminary for two reasons. Again, he does need more information regarding the grading, and secondly, he does feel there is more work to be done to meet the ZBA's charge. Do you have any questions?
Lots of them. The further grading that you have not, the further modeling that you have not seen, does this include some of the information that you're looking for or not?
First of all, I should say that we have seen 3D models, so they have been provided to staff and to the peer reviewer. Peter will best explain what has been tweaked in the model. You'll see stills this evening.
But this does not include the topographical information that you're
Well,
looking
it
for.
can't be accurate. I mean, again, Mr. Bartash will have to explain what he based that information on. I don't know where he got his data, but
Okay.
it's...
Has the applicant requested to undertake the topographical survey? Sure. Just tell us who you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for the record, Jeff Engler from SEB, representing the applicant. We requested access several weeks ago. I would say we got some positive response, fewer negative. What we would like to do actually tonight, the survey information that I think the town is most interested in relates to 5 properties. 115 Stedman, 117, 119 Stedman, 121 and 123 Stedman, 16 Manchester, and 140 Babcock. So if those people are in the audience tonight, if they could come forward after the hearing and just provide us with access, just so they can understand We don't need any access to the inside of their property. And it's also important for the quality of the survey is greatly enhanced by having all access. But if we only had 3 or 4 permission, it's choppy and it's not, it still has value, but it's not as. So my client is fully committed to pay his survey team to do as much, and they're ready to be dispatched. Usually it takes about a week or so to schedule and get a full team out there. But we're certainly committed to doing that. We're just stating for the record that, we would like, and in fairness to some of the people I listed, a few of them have already said yes. We're on board with that. But if we could just reiterate that after the hearing, we'll certainly let them know. And it also can't be, well, I'll allow them to be here on Tuesday, and somebody else says, well, they can come on Thursday. That's not how surveys are done. We would respectfully ask that we, provide a date with adequate notice, and then the survey team will be out there and do it all in one fell swoop. So that's really my comments on the survey. We understand that it's an important exercise considering the topography not only of our property, but obviously the adjacent parcels, and we'll certainly endeavor to do that prior to the next hearing.
Mr.
Great,
Chairman, I
thank
just
you.
have a follow-up question. I just wanted to make sure that the survey would extend enough into the rear yards or side yards?
Yes.
So it wouldn't be just like 4 feet over
No,
the property line?
no,
But, okay.
that's the whole, in fact, our existing conditions plan has some of the survey information, only a few feet onto the abutter property, but that's limited because it was taken from our property. By having access to the other properties, we'll certainly have a much wider swath of information to reflect. So that's what the plan is at this point in time, but we certainly appreciate and recognize that it's important activity.
Thank you. Maria, the properties that are cited, is that sufficient in your mind to give for the data required?
That does sound like it. I am going to
You'll
look at
double
the
check it.
Atlas map
Okay.
and follow up to confirm.
And I see Cliff's raising his hand.
Maria, because when we talked about the survey, we also talked about getting calipers of trees.
Yes,
That's included, yeah.
Okay.
thank you.
Maria, so on these addresses, once you confirm them, have you reached out to these neighbors to try and facilitate this process?
No, but I would be happy to.
Okay. So if there are any neighbors who are in the room from the addresses that Mr. Engler gave us, if you could please have a conversation with Maria so we could try and coordinate this. The information will be helpful. Okay? So your cooperation would be greatly appreciated.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
does this, my understanding is that we would still want as full topography analysis as possible, and that might include more than the 5 properties, so that if we are able to get, or the applicant permission for additional properties, that would be an ideal? Or am I misunderstanding that?
I think your question to me was just make sure that the properties that were listed are the direct
Right.
butters
I'm
properties.
I'm not interested in the applicant going out and disturbing neighbors or having to pay for data that is not helpful. So let's focus on the area in question. Okay. I understand that the applicant's lawyer, Robert Allen, is here to give us, shed a little light on site control. Is that correct?
Can I ask a question first?
I don't know.
Well, I will. Is there anything different between what is before us here in these plans and the plans we were given
Well, let's wait on that.
earlier?
Let's wait on that.
Oh, all right. Never mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, my name is Robert Allen of a law practice at 300 Washington Street in Brookline Village. I guess I'm a a little bit unclear as to what the issue is relative to site control. I know that the board has been provided, I know the attorney for the neighbors provided the board with a copy of the deed. The deed was
Yeah,
delivered.
there was a question about an unrecorded deed.
Yeah, the deed is unrecorded. That does not, so let's go back to Real Estate 101, Mr. Chairman, that you well know. You probably have one of the best title guys in your law firm, going back to 1800s, you know. Recording a deed is there to put the world on notice that somebody might have a lien on the property. Here, there's no issues relative to lien. The deed was delivered with the intent to deliver. It was notarized. It was delivered to the grantee, the grantor, and there's no issue. It's
So there's been delivery and acceptance.
absolutely. Consideration, every element is there. You've been provided with a copy of the deed. There's really no issue.
Okay. I want to welcome Judy Barrett.
Hi, nice to see you.
Judy, thank you for coming up. So you may or may not have been following this whole line of questioning about site control. There has been raised a question about whether an unrecorded deed raises concerns about site control, and I would add to it, whether even if it does, whether it's within the purview of the ZBA. Maria, and just so you know, Maria started when she gave her summary that she had reached out to Mass Housing
Right.
and has not been able to get a definitive response.
Don't shoot the messenger.
Is that you?
But I have a messenger, yes, for purposes of this question. The subsidizing agencies, whether you agree or disagree, have adopted a practice of responding to site control questions. If they think it's serious enough, they might look into it during the board's hearing, but basically their position is that they will review all of this when the project comes in for final approval anyway, which is a phase, after the comprehensive permit process. So if there's an issue at that time, they'll address it. But the regulations that have been in effect since 2008 indicate that the review and determination for site control is part of the basic eligibility requirements that the subsidizing agency looks at in determining whether to grant a project eligibility letter. And if they determine that the applicant meets those requirements, public agency, nonprofit organization, has site control, and so forth, that their determination is conclusive. And so that's the situation you've got, is that they've made a determination. I'm not advocating for that position, I'm just explaining to you what it is.
I've seen some case law which says that it is presumed that site control is there, but that it's a rebuttable presumption. I think the name of the case is ESAI, E-S-A-I, but I won't
Oh, yeah.
swear on that.
Yeah, it's the Andover case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that tells me that, well, the ultimate determination may be made by the state. There is still room for any party to give evidence that there is insufficient site control.
And so then the question is, what are you going to do with that evidence?
Well, you can't have the hearing if we don't have site control, because that's a jurisdictional requirement.
I understand, but the state regulations right now give the authority to make that determination to the subsidizing agency. So Maria correctly has gone to the subsidizing agency and asked for an additional review or their opinion, and they're not responding, as I understand it.
Wouldn't state law, legal
The question is,
decisions
is the statute that clear as to who makes that determination?
No, wouldn't state law trump when you're trying to determine the meaning of a statute? If you have I don't know what level ESAI was, whether it was Superior Court, et cetera, but why would that be thrown out?
I'm not saying it would be thrown out. I guess what I'm encouraging you to consider is there are a lot of issues with this project. As I understand it, there's a whole lot of issues. I haven't been here every single meeting, but the last time I was here, there were a whole lot of issues. And I have a feeling there are going to be a whole lot more issues tonight. I think you have to decide how important is it to push this issue, given what the state regulations say right now as to who makes this judgment about the determination of adequate site control. I can't make that decision for you. I'm saying I think you need to decide as a board, given everything going on with this project and the things that you are particularly concerned about, how far do you want to push this matter? And toward what end? Toward what end?
I think this is a mass housing issue.
I would need to see the case again, but I'm not saying that you're not right. I mean, and maybe it's an issue for another party to raise and prove, which might then be appealable. But I agree with Judy that at this point,
Yes.
we should go forward. And also, it seems to be agreed between you and council that an unrecorded deed can demonstrate site control, and if that's true, then haven't we made it home?
Well, I'm not answering the question of whether it demonstrates site control. Mr. Allen is correct that delivery and acceptance of a deed is transfer. Okay? Massachusetts is a notice state. We record these documents as notice. So that piece is correct. Now, whether that qualifies as site control, I'm not opining on that.
Okay?
But what Ms. Barrett is telling us is that this is something that is within the scope of mass housing in this particular case.
Under the current state regulations?
Under the current state regulations. Well, that's all we're operating under. So,
Well, I'll take what I can get at this point. Let's move on for now.
okay. So next I want to call upon the applicant to give us the overview of the revised plans. Peter, I assume it's you?
Excuse me for flipping into your...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Peter Bartash with Cube 3 Studio. We are the project architect, and tonight we're going to walk through a presentation to describe all of the changes that we've made since we were last here in front of the board. There was a question raised during the introductory period here about potential changes or differences between what you'll see tonight and the package that was handed to you toward the middle of last week. What's happened is, coming out of the working session that we had with the planning staff and with the peer review architect, we were asked to provide additional information related to site grading, related to the relationship of our proposed project to the site grading, as well as additional site sections and other drawings to describe more fully the proposal that we're putting in place. And so we've gone through the plans, we've gone through the digital modeling, and reproduced all of the views, the elevations, and the plans to be fully coordinated from start to finish here in this presentation. So there are no substantial or material differences from the materials that were shown to you in concept, and in fact the information we have here this evening is more accurate than what was shared with you last week. With regard to the question about grading, we will talk about that when we get talking about these site sections. What Mr. Engler was referring to with regard to the survey information that we currently have available to us is that at the time the site was surveyed, prior to us beginning design work, the surveyor did include grading and some tree information, I think between 4 and 6 feet outside of certain areas of our property, based on what they were able to scan from our property. The modeling that you're seeing this evening has been coordinated fully with their survey. So to the extent that we've been able to model to the data that is available to us, we have done that. Once we have the additional information from the subsequent surveys, we will continue to expand our grade modeling to reflect those real-life conditions. At present, the conditions that we've included within the model are based on information that is publicly available on Google Earth, and just our anecdotal observations of the site itself. So it is not scientific by any means, and if anyone has tried to use Google Earth as a way of obtaining grading information, it's not the easiest way to do it. So we're appreciative that the developer has agreed to do the additional surveying, and that the board is assisting with that effort, in the sense that it's just facilitating the conversation, because it will greatly allow us to improve our accuracy as well. So without further ado, getting into this, I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of the changes that have been made to the proposal since it was last shown to the board. There's a lot of text on these slides, so I'm going to try to summarize what's there and kind of keep moving. And then we'll walk through the plans, the sections, elevations, and perspectives, and see the updated shadow studies that correspond with the revised massing. So looking at a description of the changes. So we've reduced from 62 units to 52 units and increased from 31 parking spaces to 41 parking spaces. So that's a decrease of 10 units and an increase of 10 spaces. The updated parking ratio is 0.79 spaces per unit. And Maria was accurate in her report in that we are relying on semi-automated parking lifts to be able to increase our parking capacity. We have redesigned the garage to increase the amount of parking that's provided within that garage footprint as a baseline, and then we've incorporated the lift systems to further increase the parking capacity. We have increased the step back facing the Stedman and Butters by adding plus or minus 5 feet at floors 2 through 4, and setbacks the entire top floor by almost 26 feet. And so what you're going to see when we look at the plans, when I mentioned that we had updated the plans since our meeting last week with the town, that plus or minus 5 feet is indicated because it is not one line fits all across any of our setbacks. I think we tend to discuss setbacks in terms of absolutes. We say what's the furthest that the project encroaches into the side or rear or front yard setbacks. And we're bumping and jogging the foundation and the facade of the building in a way that provides more setback in some areas and less in others. So I can't say here is the only setback because we don't think that that minimum number represents the actual condition that we're designing along those facades. So we'll look at that in more detail as we look at the elevations and the plans and perspectives. We've removed the loading zone, and we've relocated the garage entry to the side facing 120 Babcock. There were a couple reasons that we made this shift. We've maximized the sight distance for vehicles traveling southbound on Babcock, which is toward Harvard Street. The traffic peer reviewer had focused on concern over the previous sight distance from the other area of the driveway entry based on the curvature of Babcock Street and other potential obstructions such as bushes and trees along the street edge. So we're putting the entry and exit to the property at the location where there's the greatest possible sight distance from the curve that comes around Babcock Street as you're facing toward Harvard. It's also co-located with the existing curb cut that's there today that it is utilized by the 44 cars that currently park at that location. We've preserved as many of the existing trees and as much green space as possible along the northern portion of the project, which is facing the abutter at 140 Babcock Street, by eliminating that loading zone and moving the garage. We've also managed to maintain, by doing this, the existing fire hydrant location. There's no more conflict with that fire hydrant. It's increased the separation between the frontmost portion of our facade, which is facing Babcock Street, and the building at 120 Babcock Street. We're intentionally trying to create some visual separation between those two buildings so that they don't just read as one monolithic building. And we'll see that when we get to the perspectives. And I had discussed the fact that the curb cut currently serves 44 cars and would be repurposed to serve the 41 cars that we're parking within the garage. It's not all the changes yet. We've centered the residential entry on the Babcock Street facade to align with the view corridor down Freeman Street. This was a very specific point that was raised as part of the peer reviewer's analysis of our previous design, which had the garage entry located on the center of the building, facing down that view corridor. And we've really attempted to drive the design of the frontmost facade around addressing that view corridor and addressing the park across Babcock Street. We've decreased the width of that facade facing Babcock Street and also of the portion of the building that's closest to the abutters that sit along Manchester Street. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail when we look at the plans. We've maintained the shade tree and hydrant on Babcock Street, which we talked about. We've also maintained as many of the trees as we could on our property facing the abutters on Stedman and Manchester, and that comment does not relate to trees that are outside of our property boundary, which we do not have fully documented or accurate information on at this time. We have added an outdoor roof deck at the area of the step back facing the Stedman Street abutters. We've enlarged our trash room, and as I said, we had incorporated the semi-automatic lifts to increase the parking capacity in the garage footprint. This last comment really talks about the the concept or theme behind the changes that we've made to the project. Beyond the stylistic differences between this proposal and the previous proposal, there are some very intentional decisions that were made with regard to building footprint, view sheds, and an analysis of the visual impacts of the project on the abutting properties and on Babcock Street. Effectively, we looked at the footprint in the previous proposal, which drew kind of long straight lines along most of the property lines and just extruded it up into the sky and maybe stepped back a little bit at the top floor. And we said that the scale of the massing that created was really inconsistent with the neighborhood. And we started to look at the neighborhood and the width and length of some of the homes that sit around the project and said, how can we start to use the dimensions from the buildings that are around our property to drive the dimensions of and widths of the facades that we're presenting to the neighborhood and to these view corridors. So when we look at the plans, the longest portion of facade of the building that is relatively unbroken is the portion that faces 120 Babcock Street. That being kind of an also long and unforgiving facade. So we're really kind of marrying those two conditions together. And then we're stepping and jogging the footprint in larger moves facing Stedman Street, facing Manchester Road, and facing Babcock Street to start to reduce the overall width of some of these portions of the facade that are going to be perceived as primary by viewers from the abutting context. The reason I'm spending so much time describing this now is so that I can spend less time describing it as we're looking at the images and the plans. That's the basic thought and concept and approach. And what it ends up doing is it allows us to start to tee up a strategy for fenestration and for materiality that responds to those same conditions. So on Babcock Street, we're proposing the use of masonry that is similar in tone and in detailing and in texture to the building at 120 Babcock Street next door, and similar to the buildings that are across the street at the intersection of Freeman and Babcock. But then we're transitioning to lap siding, and we're using a mansard-style roof with architectural shingling that starts to mirror some of the materials and conditions that we find in the surrounding properties and start to have a more residential character. That's not to say that they are a perfect replica of everything that's around it, but it's intended to be a gesture toward a more residential architecture in the areas of the property that are more residential, that are tied in more closely with that surrounding community. So looking at the site, this is just here for reference in case we want to talk about the site or look back at any of the data about the site. I think everyone is pretty familiar with it at this point. Jumping straight to the building plans. So all of these plans are oriented with north at the top of the page, Babcock on the right side of the page, Stedman is to the left side, Manchester Road is to the top side of the page, and 120 Babcock is to the bottom side of the page. So what we've done in more detail here is we've called out the specific bumps and jogs and dimensioned all of the nuances of the building footprint, which had not been detailed or described in the plans that were given to the board to review last week. And so, for instance, where we're showing in the rear a rear yard setback of 15 feet 2.5 inches at the upper leftmost corner of the building, you'll notice that we have a 4-foot bump out on that facade that does reduce that setback by the 4 feet that's shown in that location. So when I mentioned that there are areas of the plan that have less setback, that's what I'm referring to, in that they have some areas have less setbacks and have more from the sight lines. But again, it's all in service of this idea that we're starting to create smaller portions of the facade that become manageable in elevation and through articulation, which we'll see in a moment. But to talk briefly about the logic behind the reorganization of the plan. So in the lower right-hand corner is the new entry driveway, which is in the location of the existing entry driveway. And I'll see if I can get a cursor. Here we go. So the driveway is located in this position here, and it does turn 90 degrees to the entry doors, which allow you to access a double-loaded drive aisle. It's 24 feet in width. Again, we have not had this vetted by the peer review consultant for parking or traffic, and that will come in further discussion as we are starting to finally settle down on some of these changes to the plans. In the frontmost portion of the building, we do have a mail and package room that's immediately to the left of an entry lobby and vestibule that comes through the center of the Babcock Street facade. And to the right, we have a residential entry lobby that accesses the elevator and the egress stair that runs up through the building itself. As we go back along the drive aisle and turn right, we do have our trash room, which I mentioned we had expanded. We are now accommodating up to 5 of these, they're called 72-yard containers or 60-yard containers. They're a container that we've used in similar projects such as this in similar conditions. We don't have a trash narrative in place at this time. It's something we're in the process of working on. We're confident in the size and approach to designing this trash room based on our experience, but rather than just saying that and having you take our word for it, we're going to speak to that in more detail at a later time as the plans are kind of settled down. You'll notice in the upper left-hand corner of the plan here and the lower left-hand corner, we have spaces carved out for mechanical use within the garage itself. And the reason being, and we'll see this as we get to the site sections, but I gotta go back, sorry. As we get to the site sections, ultimately, the grade of the property itself increases in height by 8 feet from Babcock Street to the southwesternmost corner of the property itself. From there, the property then decreases in height by between 2 and 3 feet toward the northernmost boundary and continues to fall off in both directions toward Manchester Road and toward Stedman Street. We've included later on in the presentation a brief snapshot of some of the grading that we currently do have in place along the Stedman Street aspect of the project, and we'll talk about how that grading reacts with the project itself in our garage. But what we've done is we've set the garage elevation of the parking slab below the elevation of Babcock Street. So the driveway has a slight decline into the parking area here, and the parking area is flat back through the site. So by the time we're at the rear of the garage, the parking area is buried by almost 10 feet of grade that's stacked up against the outside of the building. So when Maria had mentioned that we had looked at subgrade parking and that it didn't have a major effect on the overall height of the building, it's because we're really pretty close already to almost doing a quote-unquote subgrade level. This is about as far down as we can reasonably go without going truly below grade and adding another layer of complexity and technical difficulty to the project. And doing that only increases challenges with the ramping and decreases our parking count, and it has a whole other host of negative impacts on the project, which is why we've chosen not to pursue that further. But there were some comments about how the grading and how the changes at this garage have affected the height of the building, and I want to talk about that, but once we get to the site sections. The way the parking garage is now designed from a height standpoint does impact the height of the building. We've added some height to that level. We've added about 2.5 feet to accommodate the additional height we needed to get the second layer of cars on top of the first. But rather than taking that and pushing the building up, we've pushed the garage slab down. So the absolute height from the top of the parking slab to the top of the garage, top of the building has increased, but the position of the top of the building has not increased from the position of the previous proposal. So if you imagine the building grew into the ground rather than up. Looking at the second floor, you'll see that we've just relocated and shifted the demising around within the project. We are now proposing 22 studio units, which represents approximately 42% of the project, 19 one-bed units, which represents approximately 36%, 5 two-bed units, which represents approximately 9%, and 6 three-bed units, which represents approximately 11% of the project. So that's 52 total units.
How has this changed the bedroom count from before?
It's relatively consistent with the bedroom count as before. I don't have the exact shift in bedrooms from one to the other, but that's an analysis that we can do and provide to the board upon follow-up.
Yep, I'd like that. Go ahead.
So you'll notice that the strategy, as you move up from floor 2 to floor 3, we've combined a studio and a one-bed unit in the lower right-hand corner to be a larger 3-bed unit. And that carries up. As you'll notice as we kind of go further up the building, the bump outs stop, when we get to the upper floor, you'll see, I'm going to toggle between floors 4 and 5. You'll see the rear portion of the building gets stepped back, and you'll see that the entire footprint of the building around the perimeter gets stepped back as well to create some relief at the uppermost floor. The area of this 5th floor is within the area of the mansard roof, and you'll start to understand that when we look at the section and look at some of the perspectives and elevations. So looking at the building sections, I mentioned having some of that topographic information for the abutting properties. So here, this heavy black line along the top of the screen running left to right, that's our rear property line. All of these dashed lines that you see are the topographic lines. And you'll notice that we have kind of extensive information about what's on our site, and we have information for between kind of 3 and 5 feet beyond the boundary of our site, but we don't have information beyond that point. I mentioned an area where the grade was roughly 8 feet above the elevation of Babcock Street, and that elevation is right in this location in the southwesternmost corner of the property. From this location to this location, the grade changes from roughly 58.3 feet to 52.1 feet based on the information that we have. So that's an elevation change of 6 feet. Now, what that isn't saying is that the grade doesn't fall back further or that the grade is not further depressed as we get closer to Stedman Street, and that's something that we're working on finding right now. All of our sections and all of our modeling and all of our information have been coordinated with all of the grading that we see and we have available to us today. So we've made some educated guesses about what's occurring beyond the extent of what we're showing here in this survey. And that's the information that we're going to be updating as we get new information. But based on the information that we currently have today, we've generated these site sections. This is a section cut through Babcock Street all the way to Stedman Street. Babcock Street is on the left-hand side, or left of center of the screen. Again, I mentioned that the grade does rise up till it meets the front of the building, and then it continues to rise until it's roughly 8 feet above the elevation of the street. It then falls off sharply to the rear of the Stedman Street abutters, and then continues to fall as it heads towards Stedman Street. So when I mentioned that the overall height of the building and the position of the parapet had not changed, what I was referring to is that the height of the garage has increased, but we've addressed that by lowering the location of the garage slab. So you'll see that Babcock Street, the entry driveway, which is dashed in, does decrease slowly as you reach the ramp itself. And then the garage slab itself is flat all the way back throughout the extent of the project. So by the time you're at the rear of the project, the grade is almost covering the entire garage. So we've included a scale figure right up against the rear abutting home here, and we've included a sight line at a 30-degree angle from that person's eye line, which is roughly 5 foot 10 inches above the ground. It's a slightly taller person. It's below my eye line, but it's above Sam's eye line. And what it ends up doing is we've indicated how that line of sight addresses or reaches past the step back that we're proposing at that uppermost level on the facade facing the Stedman Street abutters. Again, when we look at the elevations and perspectives, you'll see that this is the case, but these sloped areas indicate the areas where we have the mansard roof. So what we've done is we've really attempted to bring the roof down and make the uppermost or apparent floor a part of that roof. So it's almost as if it's within the quote-unquote attic space of that facade. We've attempted to reduce the overall scale of the facade that is presented to, for instance, the Stedman Street neighbors, to a 2.5 or 3-story facade so that it feels more consistent and more palatable. That's not to say that you can't perceive the roof of the floor beyond this step back, in which we're indicating that that's the case. We're also showing that the proposed roof deck is set back from that roof edge so that the railing and the deck itself are not visible from those rear yards, and there are no clear lines of sight from that deck back down into those yards. Now, what we've also done, per the Brookline zoning bylaws, in a condition where the property slopes up to the face of the building or is sloping upward away from the street, the methodology for measuring building height is actually driven by taking the average grade across the entire site and measuring that to the highest piece of the roof structure. And so we've actually adjusted the information in this package to reflect that measurement, as it is how Brookline does measure its height from its bylaw, which will increase, it will show an overall height, I believe, of 54 feet from that average grade measurement to the absolute highest point on the roof. What I will say relative to that is that we've done a very early pass at looking at the site grading. There is no updated or revised grading plan for the site. That's something that's in process and will be presented to the board at a later date. We're just taking the information we have right now and trying to start understanding what those numbers are so we can use them and look at this accurate information as we compare either successive iterations or further discuss the project. So when I look at the cross-section through the site, and here 120 Babcock Street is on the left-hand side of the screen, the proposed project is in the center of the screen, and then we have some of the homes that are actually on Stedman Street appearing on the right-hand side of the screen. They are in the distance because this section cut, which is a little difficult to see in this key, is cutting through the rearmost part of the courtyard at 120 Babcock Street through the long portion of the turned leg of our building. So it's running from south to north through the turned portion of the building, and then it's running through the backyards of the homes that sit facing Manchester Road and Stedman Street and Babcock Street that all kind of share that backyard space. And so here what we're seeing is the position of our building and its roof height relative to the position of 120 Babcock Street. The height of this location and relative distance and height of this building was determined through a visual survey of the height, counting bricks, really kind of doing 3 or 4 different things to try to verify exactly what the height is of this building. We don't have a laser scan or a scientific accurate, let's say, analysis of exactly what that building height is, but we're confident in the accuracy that we're showing in this section as it relates to our proposed building. And again, these grades are coordinated with the known grades that we have in our possession to date. As we get more information for some of the properties that sit on Stedman Street and Manchester Street, this information will be updated in the right-hand side of this section, and we'll talk about that as we have more information at a later date. Looking at the elevations, there were some comments about the style of the building in some of the peer review comments about the fact that the previous proposal was very industrial, it was very harsh, it was kind of cold, it didn't really do anything to try to speak even one bit of the language of its kind of vernacular in that area. And so what we've done, as I had mentioned, is we looked at this kind of two-part approach where we have a facade that faces Babcock Street that addresses kind of the language of the building that's nearest to the project at 120 Babcock Street, across the street at the intersection of Freeman Street and Babcock Street. And then we have a secondary language that is using residential materials and starting to use bays to manage the scale and start to respond a little more closely to the residential homes that sit surrounding the project on the northern side and on the western side. So when you're looking at this elevation in this kind of flat perspective, we've created a little bit of a street elevation to show you how the project relates to the property at 120 Babcock Street. And you're also seeing all of the facades or components of the building kind of completely flat. So when I say that, what I mean to say is that the leftmost portion of this elevation is stepped back from the point that my cursor is hovering over past this bay into this line here. That's the elevation that's closest to Babcock Street. And then the elevation on the right-hand side is the elevation in the rear where the building turns. You'll see that we're using trim. We're using a differentiation through some corbelling at the uppermost floor and then using dormers and the mansard roof to begin addressing the visual scale of the project and begin addressing the style of the project as well. And a lot of these sorts of methods of articulation are methods that we see in the nearby building and also in other buildings in Brookline and surrounding Brookline as well. The idea of using the brick up to a point and then changing the tone of the brick and changing the texture of the brick at the upper floor to kind of create differentiation and to start to group the kind of base, middle, and top of the building. So we're starting to try to employ a more traditional method of architecture to dress up this facade a bit. When we look at the facade that faces to the north, I mentioned that we do transition from kind of the masonry look of the building to the lap siding and corner board and trim look of the building, and we're using colors that are more traditional. They're more traditional, kind of the cream or tan colored trim, and the green or kind of sage green siding. Those are relatively traditional colors. It's got the dark roof, again, with the light dormers, and you can see these brick bays that we've integrated that help tie the base of the building with the body of the building, but also start to reduce the visual length and scale of this facade. So again, I talked about borrowing dimensions from the neighborhood and trying to use those as a strategy for massing. So what I mean to say is that when you look at this elevation, if you're looking from the left to right, you know, we start to have a roughly a 40 to 50 foot portion of the building that is grouped by it's in one plane, and it has a certain material and a certain kind of look and feel. We then have a 50 or so foot area of the building that then presents itself as one facade, but is tied into the greater body of the building. The building turns, and we have another 40 to 50 foot facade in this location that turns and becomes what you see. What we're not showing in this view are any of the trees or any of the screening or anything in front of this building. We're just showing you the raw elevation of this building to describe how some of these strategies are perceived if this building were flat and we looked at this in this way, which we never would, because you never see it like this in real life, which is also why we are going to show you some view corridors in a second. And then on the right-hand side of the building, again, we step down, we pull the roof down to really create that step back at the upper floor and to start to lower the scale of the building on the rear portion of the project. Here we're looking at the rear facade, and as I mentioned, we did coordinate all of the grading in these elevations with the grading that we know to date and today, and that's why, as you can see, the first floor here, this garage is partially buried as we're showing. I mentioned that you're really seeing kind of two levels or two floors of this facade of the portion of the building that's close to the Stedman Street abutters. The third or the fourth floor of the building, which is effectively the third residential floor, is tucked into the roof. And then the building steps back, and this roof is the roof beyond that sits at the backside of the single loaded corridor at the fifth floor. This is the southern elevation that faces 120 Babcock Street. You'll notice that we do have a retaining wall, and there are two retaining walls. There's this retaining wall that faces Babcock Street and another retaining wall that faces this side elevation, this elevation in particular of our project. And those retaining walls are necessary to create the access into the garage at that lower level, but that also allow us to maintain as closely as possible the existing grades on the rest of the site around the perimeter of our buildings. We're trying to leave that grade as close to its current condition as we can. So when we start to look at the perspectives, we've done a few things to these views, and what we've done is we've improved, again, I mentioned the accuracy of the context, both with regard to the grading, also with regard to the heights and proportions of the surrounding buildings to the extent that we could glean that information. We've also started to go in and more closely model actual tree conditions and actual tree heights and tree cover based on what we've seen in the imagery that we have of the site. If I were to leave this view from Freeman Street exactly as you would experience it in real life, there are far more trees in the Freeman Street Park and along Freeman Street that would show up in this view. We've taken those trees out, not for the purpose of being deceptive or disingenuous, but so that we could show the facade of this building as it relates to the Freeman Street view corridor and start to put that building in context of 120 Babcock Street to the left. As we get a little bit closer, you'll see that now we're standing where Freeman Street curves into Babcock Street and allows you to travel northward as you make a right-hand turn at this intersection. So 120 Babcock Street is in the leftmost corner of the view. We have 140 Babcock Street directly in front of us. And as I had mentioned, the grading and all here is coordinated with the grading that we received from the site survey, which was prepared doing a laser scanning or a digital scanning of the existing topography. Here is a view corridor looking south along Babcock Street. This was a view that was actually generated within the peer review architect's original report on our first proposal for the project. And the question came in with regard to how the building sits in relation to Babcock Street in our front yard setback. So we've been asked, again, by the planning staff and also by the peer reviewer to make our front yard setback consistent with the setback at 120 Babcock Street. So As you see here, we are not consistent with the setback of 120 Babcock Street. Our building is 2 feet closer to Babcock Street than the existing building at 120 Babcock Street. And we've actually had a survey to tell us where the corner of that building is in relation to its property line, so we could understand exactly how we sit in relation to that building. But we wanted to show this view so that the board could understand and comment on at least how this building impacts sightlines and view corridors up and down Babcock Street. And we will show a similar view from the other side. Here, we are on Manchester Street or Road, looking across those backyards and to the project. And so you'll see that the grade does slope up significantly as it does reach our property. And we've heard that from peer reviewers. We've heard that from the board, that there is a difference in the grading of our site and the surrounding properties. It is possible that the rear yards that are shown in kind of the middle ground of this image here are lower than what is being shown in this view. That's, again, information we're working on confirming right now. But what we do know is that anything you see that's green here in this location is accurate relative to the information we have available to us today. I'm going to keep going around the corner here. So here we're starting to make the turn from Manchester Road onto Stedman Street. And we're looking in between some of the existing homes at the corner of the building where we stepped down from 5 floors to 4 floors. And we're looking at that step back in some of the view corridors from that location. Here now we're further making that turn and looking at the same sort of view at the rear of the property. We've omitted tree cover here. We've omitted landscaping to be able to talk kind of just about the view of a massing of this building in relation to some of the other homes here that surround the proposed project site. And here we're looking in between some of the abutters on Stedman Street up at the proposed building. And so what's just to the right of this is the existing building at 120 Babcock Street. This location, or this light green color you see here, is that grade change between our property and the existing property, which was shown at the exact same dimension in the materials that were provided to the board at the last or earlier last week, but it just wasn't rendered as green or kind of described as or shown as the hill that it is. And again, we're updating that as we get more and more information. Here's the other perspective on Babcock Street. We are on right in front of the 120 Babcock Street property that exists next door to the project site, and we're looking north along Babcock Street. And again, the facade of our building is 2 feet closer to the property line than the facade at 120 Babcock Street. So this is the other perspective of our project, showing the entry location to the driveway. The landscaping that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the image here is the existing landscaping on the abutting property. We've started to show or talk about and think about some of the landscaping and buffering around the building, but it's not something that we can really get into until we have all the rest of the grading looked at, until we have a revised grading plan, and we have a full understanding of exactly what the space is around our project. I mentioned that the garage entry and this driveway space was provided for by creating these 2 retaining walls. So what's shown in the left-hand corner, or this little sliver of this view, is that retaining wall that holds the grade up along the side of the property. And there's another retaining wall that's obscured by the grade here in this view that creates the cut for the driveway entry. So this is that street level view again, or that street facade, just so we can understand how the height of this building relates to the building next door at 120 Babcock Street, and to understand kind of how, at least from a stylistic standpoint, we're starting to draw some connections and some parallels between those 2 buildings, and really trying to create those relationships here because we do think that those buildings are of a similar scale or of a similar kind of character. So we did update the shadow studies based on the revised massing. Each slide shows the kind of 4 primary points of study throughout the day. We have early in the morning at 7 a.m. and again at 9 a.m. We have a midday at 12 and then mid-afternoon at 3 o'clock. And areas in red on these shadow studies represent new shadow that's being created by our building that is not there today. Anything that's in black or in that kind of darker gray color is existing shadow. So to look quickly kind of in a clockwise direction from left all the way down to the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that we're adding some shadow to the southernmost area of the property early in the morning. We are shadowing the rear yards of the neighbors on Stedman Street at 9 a.m. in the morning on March 21st. We are then casting a partial shadow into some of the rear yards of the homes from Stedman and Manchester Road, and also at 140 Babcock Street at 12 o'clock in March. And then again, a similar condition here where we're doing the same thing at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in March, when the sun's a little lower in the sky. As we look to the next slide, which is in June, so now the sun angle is a little bit higher in the sky. I didn't mention this in the last slide, but for the purposes of these studies, north is up on the page, so the sun is moving or tracking from the right-hand side of each of these images down across the bottom, and then to the left-hand side as it goes from morning to evening, which is why you're seeing the shadows kind of swing in a clockwise manner from left to right as we look at each of these different shadow studies. And you can see the conditions are similar, where we're adding shadow to 120 Babcock Street. We're adding shadow to a portion of the rear yards of the neighbors on Stedman Street in the summer at 9 o'clock in the morning. By noon, we're casting some slight shadow on the northern side of our property that mostly falls on our property, but does spill over our property line and onto the yards of some of the abutting homes. And the same is true again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in June, with the addition of some shadow that falls onto Babcock Street. This is the same series of slides taken in September. What this does not account for is any shadow that's cast by vegetation, by existing trees, that might be throwing shadow onto the ground plane or not. We're just talking specifically about the shadow coming from structures in this area. And you can see that the trend is the same as the previous slides, where you see the times of day where we're casting shadow onto our abutters or onto the surrounding properties. And then we look at the same for December, where the shadows are really the longest and the most impactful. So that concludes an overview of the changes that we've made to the project, and I'd be happy to answer any of the questions the board might have.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like you specifically to walk through, for those of us who are slower than others, that means me,
I'm there with you.
the setbacks and how they've changed, and the step backs.
Sure. So I'm going to go back to the plans to get that information. Just bear with me one moment. Actually, this will be faster. So I'm going to start at the northernmost corner of the project, or the northeasternmost corner of the project. And I'm going to move all the way around the plan itself. And is it okay with the board if I walk up to the screen and talk about it from there?
Sure.
I just turned 32. I can't really see those numbers anymore. So originally we had the loading zone in this northeasternmost corner here. And so the facade of the building was set back by more than 20 feet from this property line. And the overall setback did decrease as you moved from east to west, because our building is not parallel with that property line. When we relocated the garage entry to this location on the southeasternmost corner of the property, what we ended up needing to do was to take this portion of the building in this location and push it slightly closer to the northern property line here. So our setback now, at its greatest point in this northeasternmost corner, is 18 feet 6 inches. At this corner. Now again, I said that we did introduce some jog in the plan, and what I mean by that is about 34.5 feet from the street, the building facade does jog toward the property line by 4 feet 6 inches. So what that means is that the setback goes from 18 feet 6 inches to 14 feet. Once we get 35 feet in from the air point of the building that's closest to the street. And from there, we have 2 bump outs that are each 3 feet in depth, located on that facade. So at the point where the building is closest to the northern part of the property line here, we have just over 10 feet, I think it's 10 feet 5.5 inches, from the face of that bump out to the property line itself. So in the previous proposal, we had a straight line that ran straight back, and we had just under 10 feet, I think it was 9 feet 6 inches or so at this innermost corner here, and more than 20 feet at this location here. So we've really started to vary the facade, especially as it relates to the property lines. So doing the same analysis, turning the corner and starting to look at the northernmost portion of the plan, what we're showing is in the northwesternmost corner, where we're closest to the property line, we're showing a 9-foot 10-inch setback. And that setback is relatively consistent at the ground floor as it runs from west to east along the rear of the facade. When we look at the next floor up, you'll see that the building footprint at the residential level changes a little bit, so there's going to be some shift in how we relate to the rear facade, or the rear property line, but that's the least setback in that portion of the project. We mentioned that there were some changes along the westernmost facade as well. We're at 15 feet 2 inches of setback from the northeasternmost corner to the rear property line. Once we come 45 feet down that facade, there's a 45-foot section of the building that does end up increasing or decreasing that setback by 4 feet 6 inches. So when we get to that part of the elevation, we're now at about 10 feet 8 inches from the rear property line. That's this 45-foot chunk here.
Can you repeat that? Just what you said, what's the?
Sure. So for this 45-foot chunk of the building, right in this location, we're at 10 feet 8 inches from the property line. For this 45-foot chunk of the building, above where I'm pointing on screen, we're at 15 feet 2.5 inches. And at this lowermost portion of the building, we're at 11 feet 10 or so inches from the property line. And again, it's because of how this building sits in relation to the property line. So our facade, I mentioned, along 120 Babcock Street is probably the flattest of all of our facades. It has the least kind of amount of articulation. And you'll see that there's 11 feet from the southwesternmost corner of the plan and the southernmost property line at that corner. There are 2 3-foot bump outs on the facade which do decrease that setback from 11 feet to 8 feet in each of these locations. But that 11-foot setback is consistent once we reach the southeasternmost corner of the building. We then push the facade another 16 feet up to the point where we have entry to the garage to allow for that turning movement into the garage itself. So for this 34-foot chunk of the building, we're effectively set back 27 feet from the property line along the southern edge here. And then we have 50 feet of the facade at the front of the property that's 11 feet 7 inches from the frontmost property line here in this location. If you were to measure the same setback at the northeasternmost corner of the plan facing Babcock Street, the Babcock Street does curve. Our building facade is orthogonal, so that setback does decrease to 8 feet 3 inches at that location. The street comes closer to the building.
Peter, I don't think I've seen a plan yet that would be most helpful, and that is having the adjacent property buildings shown. Because you can be some distance from the lot line, but if the building on the other side of the lot line is only 2 feet from the lot line, that's one thing. If it's 10 or 20 feet from the lot line, that means something else. You don't have that drawing, I don't think, do you?
We don't, because we don't have, the only information we have about positions of the surrounding structures is, or it's available only through the tax map.
Right.
And that's what we used to create the previous version of this drawing that we had in the previous proposal. We have not updated that drawing, and in addition to surveying kind of the properties in our surrounding ours for grades, we're expecting to get more accurate understanding of the positions of those homes, so we can verify the accuracy of the tax map and then overlay that on this drawing and create the same exhibit. Because we agree that that would be helpful for the board and for the peer reviewer too.
Because the assessor's plans are notoriously inaccurate.
Correct.
So getting the survey to give you that information and having those buildings located on this drawing would be very, very helpful. And the other question I have is this is the lot line to the larger existing residential complex down here. And as I recall, this area is parking for this building?
Today it is, that's correct.
Does this allow them to still use that parking area?
No, it does not.
It does not. How much more would you have to increase that setback or move the entire complex over so that they have access to that parking?
It wouldn't be possible with this proposal for two reasons. One, with the semi-automated lift system, there's no opportunity to drive through it to get to other parking spaces. All of those spaces would be tandem along that edge of the building. And it would also force us to take the retaining that we currently have at the end of the driveway and push it to the back end of the property and to lower the entire grade along that facade in order to get it to the level where it's, oh, thank you. I'll eventually get one of these. This is what I'm asking for Christmas. It would force us to take this retaining wall and push it to the southwesternmost corner of the garage and lower the elevation of the grade along this location to be consistent with the elevation of the garage. So we would lose all of our lift parking here in order to create that access, and also have to dig down in this whole location to create that access to that location too. Because there isn't, the access to these spaces today is from the driveway on this property
Right.
here. There's no access from this side.
But the grade along that edge now is flat relative to this existing parking, isn't it?
It's not.
No.
By law?
You have to go up.
Yeah, so,
Oh, okay.
yeah, you have to go up.
Well, I'm still not sure that it can't be done. I'm not sure how, but so they're going to lose all that parking is, yeah.
Well, consistent with that request, I mean, your client owns the adjacent property. Is there any reason why we don't have a distance between the proposed structure and the existing structure that's already there? I mean, I know you're taking away the parking here, but you know where the building is, and you could show it on the plan. I mean, you have access to that property.
And we'll provide that as part of the diagram that I mentioned earlier. That'll show the relationship to those existing structures, definitely.
Because as I recall, you're pretty close, close to the lot line to the, on the left-hand side property, and you're close to the lot line here.
I believe the building at 120 Babcock Street is roughly 5 feet from the property line on its side of the property, which puts our distance between our building and that building at about 16 feet at its greatest, and which is diminished by 3 feet when you encounter those bump outs that I mentioned in this location and this location.
The other question I have is, how are you handling the ventilation from your garage floor? Is it going to be a mechanical or natural ventilation?
It's actually, it's a hybrid. What we've done is, if I were to go, I don't want to jump ahead too far and then not be able to come back. So we've integrated these louvered openings
Okay.
in a way we're trying to make them at least related to what's happening above, to get as much area as we can for natural ventilation purposes, but we're going to have to provide a supplemental mechanical system within the garage to move air through the garage and out of the garage. It won't be able to be fully naturally ventilated.
So where will that exhaust occur, do you think?
Or evenly around the perimeter of the garage, because we have those openings on all but the frontmost facade.
Right.
Let's go back to the plan. So what I'm going to do now is just describe how setbacks change as we go up from floor to floor on the building. So here, it's the parking level. It's the first residential level. I mentioned that there was a slight change in the building footprint on the residential level, and what I meant is that there's a 1 foot setback at the northwestmost corner where we do change the plane of the facade, so we can change the material and the height at this corner as we drop from 5 to 4 stories in the uppermost floor. But if you look at the facade below, you'll see that the other change that we make is in the southwestern corner, where we're doing something similar to kind of create that end block of the elevation and transition from 4 back to 5 floors. All of the bays are consistent from floor up to floor here, and all of the exterior walls of this plan, except for those two locations, are coplanar with the exterior walls of the garage below. As we get to the third floor up, this floor plan matches the floor plan below that. The fourth floor plan is where you'll notice these bump outs go away, and the building facade steps back by 3 feet from the face of those bump outs in the locations where we do have those bump outs, but the rest of the footprint remains coplanar with the facade below. And once we get to the uppermost floor here, what you're seeing in plan, where this dark line is cut, is inset from the outermost position of the footprint at the floor below because of the slope of the mansard roof. So the spring point for the mansard roof is actually aligned with the outermost position of the wall at the floor below. And by the time you take the cut for the plan, you see it starts to decrease the usable amount of space within those units at the upper floor. The real significant change is this 26.5-foot setback along this rear portion of the project that I mentioned before. And so the only other thing that we haven't really talked about in much detail, but has been the subject of discussion, is this area of the roof deck and what we also have happening here from a mechanical standpoint on this roof. So when this was all a 5-story building, all of these condensers were centered over the corridor at the uppermost level, both on this short leg and also on the long leg. When we shifted this portion of the building by removing those units, we couldn't just leave these mechanical units centered over the corridor because they would be visible from surrounding properties. So we put them in a position on the lower roof where they would be visually screened by the roof and the sight lines themselves, so that they would be seen from kind of these surrounding abutting properties. And as I mentioned, we had included an 18-foot by 30-foot outdoor common space at this upper level in response to questions about providing usable open space for the residents that was available on site to them. So
Peter,
you'll see that
I have a question. Does this design mean that the 5th floor residents are looking out onto the air conditioning mechanical pieces?
No, so you'll see that this unit here in the lower left-hand corner of the plan is the only unit that could potentially have a window facing in this direction if we so chose. We actually have chosen not to have a window facing in that direction, so there's no kind of sight line from the corridor or from these units back down towards Stedman Street. The only windows or openings on this facade are in the location of the roof deck themselves. And as we had shown in the site section, because of where that's located, there's no direct line of sight from this point in the project down to those rear yards of the Stedman Street abutters. This position that I'm identifying with the cursor here, this is all the corridor for those units. So any of the units at this upper floor either face out toward Babcock or Manchester, or they face toward 120 Babcock Street.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask, you showed on a prior view of the property, somebody standing at the base of one of the Stedman Road and looking up at the deck, and illustrated that there's no direct view to the deck. My question is, what about the direct view from the deck to the homes down below?
So what we can do, anecdotally, I can point to it and say that from this location down to the homes below, you'd be able to look from this deck to the kind of roof of these homes. Like you wouldn't be able to see past the edge of the roof and directly down into their backyards. But what I'll do is we'll update this drawing to include the same analysis of sight lines from the deck in the other direction as well.
Peter, some of the homes on Stedman Street actually have like dormers, so if you could just represent fenestration.
Yeah, so that's this line right here, to the extent that we are able to kind of understand what was happening there. But we'll look at that a fifth time and do what we can.
While you've got this up, I'd like to raise another question, Mr. Chairman, that may be outside our scope of responsibility, but there's been concern expressed by the neighbors about the footings and the structure capability of the foundations here. There have been indications that there may be peat underneath here, which I find a little surprising. Are you going to be doing borings at some point?
We are.
Could you possibly do that during the time of our work so we could establish, and depending upon what comes through, so we could sort of give the neighbors some, what's the word? I'm looking for?
Reassurance.
Hmm?
Reassurance.
Reassurance, thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Anytime.
about the foundation condition. I mean, in general, you're going to have to do this for your own structural reasons
Correct.
anyway,
Right.
'cause you don't want to have your foundations fail. And I don't think there's going to be any problem, but just to give some reassurance to the neighbors, I think that might be useful to do now if possible.
Okay.
Well, would that fall within the foundational analyses that are anticipated? Great.
Kate?
Is there a plan for a retaining wall of some sort here?
So I noticed in several of the comment letters, there were questions about retaining and not understanding retaining and what was going to be seen or not seen. The retaining that you're seeing is all facing, or all of those walls are exposed to the interior of the garage. They're not exposed to the exterior. So the existing grades, to the extent possible, we're attempting to leave in their current position and stacking that up against the outside of the garage. So it's not as if we're cutting off the earth at the property line and leaving a retaining wall that is exposed to the abutters. Does that answer your question, or?
I guess it does in a way, but I'm wondering whether that's a better solution. But
You might have to have both, mightn't you? I don't-
yeah, I guess it would depend on the analysis of the soil and the drainage, and we're going to get some more information on that.
I guess one last issue that, as I recall, concerns the neighbors. You're going to be, there's some concern about the adjacent trees and the roots and destruction of the roots or damage to the roots as a result of this construction. And I was wondering if it was possible to request that a developer get an arborist to work with the tree person in the town to take a look at those trees once they've been calipered, and because then they could recognize not only the size but the types of trees, because there are some trees that are more sensitive to this sort of disturbance than other trees are, and that might be useful to have.
One thing that we sometimes request of a project team is a tree protection plan.
Right,
So that would probably
well,
be a piece that we would ask.
right, but this would be the roots themselves.
And that's the whole point of the tree protection plan, is regarding the roots.
Well, I'd still recommend you get an arborist and the tree guy to talk about, because some trees are more susceptible. I just went through this with another project.
The tree protection plan would need to be provided by an arborist,
Right.
yes.
Kate?
Well, most of my comments will, I think, come up after we hear from Mr. Bomer. So right now, I don't have questions.
Okay. The elevator stack, you have a single elevator, is that correct?
That's correct.
It's in the front. So when I'm looking at the front facade, what am I going to see for the head house?
So I'm going to I'll go to that elevation and be able to talk about that. So that elevator stack is going to come up in this location above the elevator core. The maximum distance that elevator stack would come up would be 7 feet. But if I go to the plan to show you where that sits in relation to the front facade, you'll notice that the elevator stack is set back by more than 20 feet from the front facade. So from Babcock Street, the uppermost location or roof of that elevator stack would not be visible. And we're going to clad and treat that elevator stack as if it were any other part of the building. It's not just going to be kind of an unfinished or industrial looking piece of the building going up above it, so that it at least appears purposeful. But from Babcock Street in particular, there's going to be no kind of direct line of sight to the building from the perimeter of the building. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that that's reflected in any of the street views that we have, any of the perspectives that we have, and also in the elevation as well.
Sorry? If you can go to the elevation on the rear yard, you're showing a single roof line that extends for the full distance of the building. Was there any consideration given to breaking up that mass?
It's not something that we've looked at, no. Really what that's doing is the corridor is as far away from this end of the property as we could conceivably locate it. And we could break up the mass by introducing kind of a similar bump as you see here, but it would require us to push a portion of this facade closer to this end of the project by maybe like a foot or two to create that sort of break or that articulation. And when you look at the building kind of in perspective, having this dormer here at least provides a visual break along this roofscape itself, though it doesn't actually break the roof line that you're speaking to. So I think when we look at the elevation, I'm just going to flip to one of those perspectives for a second. You know, you look at the length of this roof here, which is what you're asking about, and you see that this dormer starts to do what it is that you're talking about doing without necessarily having to change the overall plane of that roof in particular. And when you're in a view shed like this, for example, that roof line really kind of disappears behind the outermost edge of the roof below it.
One possibility is skylights. Do you have a section through that part of the building
Yep.
that shows that card? I thought you did. Let's take a look at it and
Going
see
back
what
to
that
it.
would do.
Here we go.
So there we are. So we're talking about right there.
Right.
So does that sloped wall impinge on the corridor?
It does not.
It does not?
Nope, because what we've done is we've taken the uppermost point of that slope and aligned it with the rear edge of the corridor, so it
Okay.
just gets padded out in front of the corridor.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So what do you think about skylights, Mr. Chairman?
What do I think about skylights?
Yeah, as a way to,
Well, explain to me how it breaks up the linearness of the roof.
well, it's like a dormer, but it's not a dormer. It's a skylight.
Well, I think of a
It's a window.
skylight, right, but I think of a skylight as a window on the roof, on the top.
Oh, no, you
You're
put them
thinking,
in,
you're
put 'em
thinking
in
about
the-
putting them on the side.
yeah, these mansards are
Yeah.
called roofs.
Yes.
So you put them on the mansard wall.
Mr. Bomer might have some suggestions.
Oh, should I?
I'm sure he will. Speaking of Mr. Bomer, just a question. When the ZBA last gave its charge about setbacks, what was Mr. Bomer's recommendation and what was the wording of the charge?
So the charge was increased setbacks on all sides.
Mhm.
And Mr. Bomer spent a lot of time talking about the setback to height ratio. So there was a lot of discussion at our two sessions regarding the overall height of the building. Obviously, reducing the height of that top floor, either partially or altogether, would improve the setback to height ratio. So one of the things that Mr. Bomer has recommended, and this is something that we hope the team will consider, is if you look at from Manchester Street as well, those folks are really looking at, 5 stories. Well, I know, but I'm just talking about the volume of the, there is that decline, that slope, but the building without any articulation is still a 5-story building. It doesn't have the step back on the top floor that the rear abutters, so, I don't really want to steal
No.
Mr. Bowen's thunder, but I think it's helpful to look at visuals to understand.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? No. Do you need a loading zone? You've eliminated it. Do you need it?
Our position is no, that we don't need it. But
So I'm moving into your building. Where is my truck going?
it's a reasonable question. It's a question that we raised when it was proposed that the loading zone be eliminated, which was raised both by the peer reviewer for traffic and also by our own traffic consultant as well. I think it would be better to let them speak to that issue and that question, given that we're really following kind of their direction on what they feel is most appropriate.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll look forward to that then.
Actually, one question, as preparation or going into Mr. Bomer's, I apologize if I cut you off, Jesse, discussion, are there any instances in which you actually did increase the setbacks on this new plan?
Yes, along Stedman Street in particular, we did increase, I mean, again, not for the entire length of the facade, as I mentioned, because it does step, but we did increase a portion of those setbacks. We increased the setback at the uppermost floor facing Stedman Street. We increased the setback facing 120 Babcock Street. And I think that those are really kind of the main increases of the setbacks that we did make, though obviously we did not make the entire 20 feet of setback that was requested around the building. I don't know where that number came from or who suggested it, but
Planning department?
you know, we've taken from the planning department. That's right. You know, ultimately we've taken, like I said, a more, I don't want to say more comprehensive or a holistic look at the planning of the building related to a strategy for massing and articulation that isn't just cutting straight lines down the project and saying, okay, here's the box where it lives. We think it's a little bit more holistic of a solution.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? No? Thank you. Okay. I want to call on our architectural design peer reviewer extraordinaire, Cliff Bomer, to offer his preliminary reviews. And as Maria noted for the record, this is a process in flux, so this is not Cliff's final commentary.
There is no final, but no, it is preliminary, and I'd point out that actually a lot of what you're seeing tonight's the first time I've seen it too. So a number of my comments are actually made on the previous generation of drawings that we saw on the 26th, right? 26th of September. So I'll just jump in. I don't have a lot of thunder necessarily, but I do have some suggestions, and you've heard some of it, but including some of what where Kate was going as far as wondering about what really has gotten, some of these are obscured up in the top, but anyways, I noted some of what I thought were the more interesting changes in setback. You probably remember that the original building was a 63-foot wide L. So it was the same distance, width all the way across there, wrapped around, and was 63 feet or so back at this side as well. So some of the dimensions that did change when the footprint got some more movement into it, which was, this is different from what you were just looking at. There are actually fewer. I think the new one has some bays here. There's a little bit of difference there. So this isn't quite what Peter just showed you, but it's pretty close, particularly with setbacks. So the ones that changed, that one changed. That's about almost 6 feet deeper than it was at that corner, right in that area. Other things that did change are these occasional changes in plane in the building for the reasons that Peter pointed out, was really making it less, carving away at that big box. Other changes, this is a new setback, which is significantly different because the building width decreased quite a lot. The width of the building that's closest to Babcock Street actually lost about 13 feet across there, and that piece that used to be out was eliminated to create the entry. So this setback in this zone was increased by about 35 feet. So there were changes. The one that Peter was trying to explain, which it is a little complicated up here because of the because of the tapering of the property line, but this is, this location right in here, the building actually did move closer to the neighbors. So it really did jog around quite a lot. The overall massing didn't change hugely, and some of my comments are addressed to that fact more than anything else, I think. Other changes, and some of these are lost up in the shadow there, but this was a large decrease because of eliminating that half of the 5th floor. So that, at that top, that used to be 170 feet, now it's 135 feet. So it was about a 35-foot diminishment in the width along there, or diminution, I guess. This one decreased a few feet, not much. That's not a big one. The bigger change here was the addition of the balcony, the roof deck. It's a public roof deck for all the residents of the building. So some of the things, and you should know that this peer reviewer did not make recommendations as far as style. My comments had more to do with mechanisms that can be used, whether it's modern style or postmodern style or French, mansard style, whatever it is. There are some elements that certainly were introduced into this design that didn't exist or were at least much more subtle in the previous incarnation of the building. And the biggest one, or one of the bigger ones, was, of course, incorporating the units, top floor units into a roof. Building code gets confused about whether it's roof or a wall at this point, but anyway, there are units up in there. And then also the introduction of a lot of different horizontal lines that are a mechanism for breaking up the apparent height of the building. And again, we're talking the apparent height, not the real height. Apparent height is a visual thing you experience from the street. Real height is the thing that casts shadows. So they're pretty different things, but they're both important. And you can see how by using banding in buildings, you can actually use it to make transitions, because different bands on the building can relate to different scales of the context. And I think my charge is, at least in most of the projects I've looked at with you folks, has really been thinking about mitigation. We all know that 40B buildings are likely to be larger. And so mitigation is hugely important. So again, I really didn't say anything in any of our meetings about style, but I will say that I think this style has enough in it that it's got a lot of things to work with. The historic reference I see as an independent to the way that you fit massing. And street wall, things like that are less about style than these more generic concepts that I'm talking about. This is one of the older images, but I'm bringing this one up because this is, and the development team knows that this is of particular interest to me, actually, that the setback, the front setback match the adjacent large building. And I just put the old one here. Even though the massing has changed in the new building, this corner is eroded away. So actually the width you see is back about there from this same angle. But the reason that this is one thing that I think is very important is that, remember that in my initial presentation, I talked a lot about that the public realm and the park across the street and really the street wall. And I think it's inevitable that these two buildings will be paired. They'll be viewed as an ensemble. And for that reason, to me, the setback of this building is important to pair with this building because they really are working together. They kind of can't not be, given that they're both a very similar scale. Obviously independent of ownership, pairing, and things like that. So I'll quickly go through things. Some of this is a summary of things that we talked about in the meetings and clarifying a couple points that I think Maria was hitting on. So my analysis of the overall massing, and I think you've heard this tune before, is concentrating massing where it's appropriate. And as you know, this building really only has, it kind of has three very visible elevations. There's this, and then this. That pairing is happening over here. As you know, that is a pretty minimal setback on that side. From my perspective, I think that's a good thing because it keeps it pushed to the south, further away from the neighbors to the north. That isn't something that I would recommend augmenting at all. The loss of the parking spaces, in my mind, is a separate subject. It's not really about architecture. So what this diagram is showing that, getting back to that point of mitigation, so this building really is on the edge. It's on the edge of a historic district. It's at a pretty high point. It is prominent and quite visible. And the mitigation happens both, in my opinion, should really happen from all of the important views of the building. And if I were to make an argument for where massing should be concentrated in this building, it's in this area here. That's where I think the building has the most potential for being a tall building. It has impact. Its primary impact is on its own neighbor, same property owner. And as I said, this is kind of inevitably paired with that building next door. So this to me is a logical place. And where the mitigation happens is wrapping around. And what Maria was hinting at is that rather than thinking about decorating that long run of the mansard roof on the 5th floor or breaking it up with dormers, my recommendation is eliminate it so that at this end of the building, and you'll see this in some diagrams coming up, in my opinion, this end of the building should be a story lower because it is very visible and it's close to neighbors. This is my indication of that setback. This isn't precisely drawn. I think I also look for the context being drawn in so we can talk about the alignments of the building. So that was just a diagram, not a... So these are the views, and again, these have changed a little bit. There actually has been quite a bit of more refinement, particularly in the site sections that Peter showed. Those are things I haven't seen before at that level of detail. So what happens at the rear of the building is that the mansard occupiable space is up on the 3rd residential level with the parking garage largely sunk down at the back of the building. My recommendation when we were talking and brainstorming about this was, in fact, to carry that mansard roof right around, eliminating this piece entirely, so that this is a much smaller scale, similar to the kind of scale of building that you see from the Stedman Street side. And you can see the impact is here as well. I should point out one other thing that I noticed in those new plans, there was a little bit more articulation, but these are virtually in the same plane, virtually. There was a trim line and a little bit of a bump, but that's why, to me, it's very logical to just bring down this piece and wrap it right around. And it has impact on it from a number of views. Here it is from this view. I'm suggesting the removal of that piece. From this view, it's also pretty prominent. If you can imagine this mansard wrapping right around at that level and eliminating this whole piece. So that's what I meant by, rather than skylights or more dormers, I would recommend elimination of this piece. I also think that this is a bit of a grand gesture for something that is, I think it certainly, I think from what I've been reading of neighborhood comment that's a kind of a hot button of kind of celebrating the view out over the neighbors through this kind of gesture. What this slide speaks to me more than anything, I think, is that need of what Maria's been talking about and Peter talked about as well, which is, I think, as far as an ability to really measure impact in a sense. I think, I feel like I've kind of hit a wall as far as being able to really precisely talk about impact because of not really knowing if where I'm standing in this view, if this is really what it looks like. So certainly the effort to get some really accurate site information is critical on this particular development. The grade's changing all over the place. So this is, actually, here's something that Peter talked about. I said minimize the grade change from the sidewalk to the entry. What I heard today is actually that the slab of the garage is actually at the sidewalk plane, I think is what I heard. It's a little bit lower even, okay. It is, okay. In any case, a couple of comments again, both about a couple about real height and several about apparent height and fit is, certainly minimizing the height up at this top floor. I think it's been scaled probably to include a parapet, most likely to hide some mechanical equipment, but I'd certainly be careful about that, not make it any taller than it has to be, not have equipment that's any taller than it needs to be. I also think it's worth looking at stepping the mansard in. It's a little bit of a different look, but very common to have a more significant setback at that top level. You see a lot of that in the south end and back bay, that kind of treatment. And again, that elimination of that piece would get rid of this totally. That's my suggestion, is eliminate this, then have that the third residential floor dormer wrap right around and return back up to the main body of the building. Again, we're just looking, this is the diagram of where I think if you are going to concentrate the volume, this is the right section of the building to do it in. This is that area again where these are virtually coplanar right across that piece of trim. And I'm suggesting carry that mansard across at that level. And not to beat a dead horse, but the same comment from the Babcock, or from the Stedman Street elevation. And again, I think this is kind of an overblown gesture for what it really is. So quick, again, this is, I think I made it pretty clear, it's sort of a moving target. I've commented on its change since last night. So the grades of the neighboring properties on all sides must be accurately established in order to evaluate the impacts and create revised site sections. That's the kind of feel like I've hit the wall part there as far as how worthwhile is it to really keep analyzing something when you're not really sure about the quality of the information. Next one is documentation of all site structures on the neighboring properties is critical in order to gauge the impact of the new building. There are, at least in my kind of minimal trespassing in the Stedman Street neighbors' driveways, there are some retaining walls there. There's garage backed up. There's a variety of things back there that I think need to be documented in order to really judge how to proceed. The landscape plan is really important. That was one of the points I made last time around is whatever the setbacks are, they should be credible. They should be able to support credible landscaping and certainly ensure that no damage is done to landscaping that's in place. That's really doing a lot of the work already. Delineation of the facade materials, Peter talked about some of that tonight. That's important. Coordinating the elevations and perspectives with rooftop equipment, really critical. I'm sure the developer doesn't want people to see rooftop equipment on the top, and nor do the neighbors. Calibrate SketchUp model to make it possible to accurately analyze impact, and that's, I think, where they're headed. And then updating shadow studies, which I didn't know they'd done, so we saw some of that tonight. But that's it. So it's kind of, don't have much to say beyond that, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay.
So what do you think about the lap siding on the sides of the structure and against the back? I found the fronted much more attractive and the material to be more attractive than having lap siding on the other three sides.
I think it actually works pretty well when it's especially when it's the three-story elevation with the mansard, where the smaller pieces that actually are approaching the Stedman Street neighbors. I think that works. I think it makes it less monumental. I mean, I think that, a building of this scale, it really is making it is the edge. It's the perceived edge of that historic area, and I think it's effective. It's, they have to be high quality, and there was a lot of detail on the drawings. I think having the different, even breaking up on the front, the brick elevation that did have a layer of, appeared to be wood siding on the fourth level. I think that's appropriate.
So just so I understand what you said, I believe you said that the lap siding was appropriate and it worked and helped make the building less monumental.
Yeah.
If there were 3 floors.
Well, this is what I'm talking about, is, this scale is very similar to the scale of nearby buildings. So I think as a transitional piece or as a mitigating piece, I think it's okay. I think to the degree that the building, if it were masonry all the way around, I think it only exaggerates the mass of it, I think.
So how would you handle the elevations, the side elevations on the south side and the north side in terms of addressing the massiveness?
Well, again, I've summarized what we talked about. Well, let me make a few points about that. Actually, the elevation that Peter showed, I think, shows a little more articulation than this one does, I think. Or is this identical? This is identical, okay. So I think what the mechanism that they're using here really is breaking it up into a lot of different pieces, either through a kind of like additions of bays are one way to break it up and create, casting shadows. That's really how you break up a cube, is to cast shadows on it. And that's what all of these jigs and jogs are meant to do. And I think when viewed from a residential neighborhood made up of buildings with lots of lap siding and shingles, this is an appropriate material to use.
Can you go to the picture which just shows the front of the building? Nope, there's another. I believe there was another one. Oh, it was a slightly different angle where you couldn't see.
The perspective?
I think it was a
I
slightly
can
different
go to the perspective. Oops, where'd it go?
I think it was looking at slightly from, as if you were going down Babcock to the north. Well, it's partly setbacks, but that might have been
Well,
it.
it could be like this one.
That's pretty close, but there was one full-on, which really struck me as being overwhelming to the view in terms of its height, and while there was mitigation, it looks, well, almost like an Addams Family house because it's so big and goes so high. That's an area where I find it difficult to say that there's sufficient delineation to take away from the perception that it's just a massive building.
Mm-hmm. I think when Maria mentioned that ratio of height of the building to setback, that's another reason that, for me, the setback on Babcock is really important. I think and I do think that even some changes, as I said, setting back the mansard roof, I think there are other changes that can be made that are even relatively subtle. But I will say that that concentrating massing where I think it ought to be, if it needs to be somewhere, in my opinion, given that directly across the street from this is that large open park, that makes sense to me. I'm not the architect, but I do think that the critical elevation for me is actually one that I'd never seen before, which was one that Peter showed tonight that actually showed some detail on the adjacent existing building to the left. And imagining that as the street wall on the park, I think that's how I look at this building.
So, again, to make sure I understand what you're saying, when you talk about reducing the height of the floors with the L,
Yes.
at the L, are you talking about or recommending reducing that whole section of the building?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, all the way
Oops, I went the
across.
wrong way, sorry. Well, I suggested, let me get to that diagram again. So my suggestion was that the parts of the building that are close to neighbors along this edge are actually quite close to neighbors.
Right.
Or are really visible from the smaller scale neighborhood. Those, to me, should be smaller pieces. I think that it was really these perspective views at this that I thought, because they're closer, for one thing, they're closer, they look taller, they're relatively open, clear views that are shown in those walks around in the SketchUp model. So essentially, when I should clarify this, because when I say kind of hit the wall, for me, that's as far as I got, and I realized that by looking at, taking these views that I think are very important views from the public realm, to me, that was the dead minimum that you would have to do to really make a meaningful gesture towards fitting it in. Hitting the wall is not really having enough confidence in the model and the grades that are indicated in the models and the viewpoints. That's where it kind of ended, where I just thought it made no sense for me to try to look deeper into something that really, where the information wasn't there.
Thank you.
So you're talking about perhaps making this a 4-story segment? Is that what-
The same level is back here. So just carrying this L-shaped piece. Dueling lasers here, but,
What's he gonna do with his stairway?
well, he's the architect.
It's not.
He could figure that one out. He can figure that one out. I would suggest, if I were the architect, moving it somewhere around this zone, but don't want to give away anything for free, but I think that I think it's doable.
Cliff, if you don't mind, by dropping a floor on that section, does that, in your mind, sufficiently offset the lack of increasing the setbacks from the sidelines?
That's a perfect question. That remains to be seen. I think that's why we need a richer context model. I think there's a very good chance that would be enough.
So we should be looking for some 3D modeling.
Well, and there is 3D modeling, and Peter is accurate. What he said makes complete sense to me. He worked with the material he had, but what we're talking about is what it looks like beyond where he has information. So For me, a lot of the issues about, real physical impact on that slope on the Stedman Street side, those are real issues, and the only way to understand how to deal with those that could involve moving the building back or using piles instead of strip footings or who knows what. It's all done through those site sections those were new. I hadn't seen those before, the ones that we saw tonight. So it's more study like that.
Maria, could you email these sketches of his to us?
Of course.
I think the other, and it was mentioned tonight too, even simple questions like, from that deck, can you see into the neighbor's dormer? You just don't know until you know where the neighbor's house is.
Okay, anything else? Thank you,
I don't
Cliff.
think so.
Excellent, thank you. Hi. I want to invite members of the public now to offer testimony. Again, as I've said before, I would ask two things of people. Well, I'll ask three things. One, start by giving us your name and your address. Speak loudly and clearly into the microphone so that we will have a record and that it can be transcribed so that everybody can access it. Two, listen to what your predecessors have to say. To make for a somewhat efficient hearing, I would ask if you happen to agree with your predecessor, say, I agree with them, and give us any new information that you have. If you happen to disagree with them, you could give us that information as well. And lastly, please concentrate your comments about what it is that has been offered at this hearing. So what we're focusing on are the revisions to the plan that we've seen this evening. And again, if you can focus your comments, limit your comments to that aspect. Mr. Hill, I see you're jumped up.
Thank you. I'd like to just first, Dan Hill for the record, representing neighbors on Stedman Street. I'd like to first just respond to several of the comments that were made tonight, and then I'd like to propose some recommendations for further action. First, I just want to touch on the site control issue briefly, the issue of the unrecorded deed. The reason I flagged that was that it's very unusual for a developer to have its site control in the form of an unrecorded deed. Typically, you have a recorded deed or a P&S agreement, which is a contract. The problem with an unrecorded deed is that we don't know if, first of all, we don't know the circumstances for why it hasn't been recorded, which is very atypical because it's possible that the grantor of that deed, which I believe is Richard Slater, it's possible that that Richard Slater person could subsequently execute and deliver another deed to the same property to somebody else, and that other person could record that deed and therefore completely undercut this developer's site control. So that's the issue. I only made it, I pressed the issue only to ask that the zoning board refer it to Mass Housing, which it's done, but Mass Housing hasn't responded. So I'm not going to shoot the messenger, but I would like to challenge the messenger to say I don't think it's satisfactory just to say let's move on. I'd like to know why it hasn't been recorded. I don't know. The attorney's left the room, but I don't understand why we don't have an explanation for why the deed hasn't been recorded. So I'm just going to leave it there. With respect to the trash plan, this is something that we had raised early on. It's something actually the planning department raised very early. By the way, this hearing opened in April, so 6 months is actually this month. And I was just a little surprised by the comment that was made that this is too early for for the trash management plan. I don't think it's too early at all. In fact, I think it's late. I think it's late to not have a trash management plan. I think it's late not to have a report on the lateral support issue. It's late not to have borings on the property so we understand what the impact's going to be on the neighbors. You're up against a 6-month deadline. At this point, you're at the mercy of the developer to give you month-by-month extensions. So I don't understand why that hasn't been provided. This is an issue that was raised in July and August, and we still don't have a trash management plan. It may be that their revised trash room is sufficient. Again, we don't know. By the way, these aren't 72-yard containers, okay? They're 72 inches long. These are 3-yard containers. So whether or not that's sufficient for 52 units, maybe, it may not be. I'm not an expert at it. I don't think anyone here is. With respect to the grading plan, I don't think I've ever seen a grading plan for this project. What I've seen is a site plan showing the outline of the buildings and the driveways. That's, to use the attorney's lingo, 40B 101. You know, it's very atypical not to have a site plan with grading information. In fact, it's atypical not to have architectural plans without a scale on them. The information that's been provided consistently with this project has been deficient. It's very difficult for us to evaluate these plans without having a scale. Some of the dimensions are missing, and I have to take a ruler and somehow figure out or guess as to what the setback is between my client's property and the building. With respect to the loading zone, I was surprised by the comment by the architect that that the reason the loading zone was removed was because that was the direction they were given. I don't think that was the case at all. I think the concern with the loading zone that was made by the planning board and others was its design, that it was going to be, that trucks would be backing into Babcock Street after they parked in the loading zone. I don't think anybody was advocating for the elimination of a loading zone. I think this raises more problems than it addresses by not having anywhere for any of the temporary vehicles that come and go to a project like this to temporarily park. And that kind of goes to the trash management plan. How will trash trucks pick up these 3-yard containers every week? I guess they'll have to double park on Babcock. There's nowhere for delivery vehicles to park. There's nowhere for moving trucks to park. So this is just going to cause additional congestion on Babcock inevitably. And where are these containers going to be stored when they're brought out? Are these containers going to be rolled onto the sidewalk and left to block the sidewalk? There's 3 3-yard containers proposed and 2 recycling containers. So we'll potentially have 5 containers blocking the sidewalk once a week, unless there's some other arrangement that I'm not aware of. We remain very concerned about the ventilation of the garage. This was an issue that was raised at your July meeting and your August meeting. And there were peer review reports by both your traffic engineer and your parking sub-consultant. I haven't seen any response to those by the applicant. I haven't seen any response at all from the applicant on this ventilation issue or the potential noise issue from these systems. So the ventilation or the exhaust in the garage could cause both air quality issues, impacts, and noise impacts. And tonight we heard that there will be some mechanical system used to ventilate the garage. And as you can see from this perspective, those windows, I think where they're called louvers, all face the back of my client's properties on 7th Street. And they're approximately, well, one section is 10 feet away and the other section is 15 feet away. So these are very, very close to our backyards. Again, this was an issue that was raised in July. It's disappointing that here we are in October and not have any more details on how this is going to work. Mr. Bomer, my takeaway from his presentation was that he was really advocating that this project correlate to the 120 Babcock Street project. That's an existing building, and that this building should, mirror it in terms of its front yard setback, its scale and massing, I guess. I guess my question, and maybe it's too obvious, why aren't we reducing the height of this building to 4 stories all around the building? If you look at this diagram, a 4-story building would almost perfectly match the height of 120 Babcock. So why not eliminate not just a portion of the 5th story, as Mr. Bomer advocated for, but eliminate the entire fifth story? I also question the representations that were made about the views of this roof deck from the 7th Street neighbors. On the slides that were shown by the architect, the person standing, looking up, was standing right outside the house, not in the backyard. There was no analysis as to whether or not people inside the house could see the roof deck from their windows, the 2nd-story windows. There was no analysis for whether a person standing on the roof deck, I think actually the member made this point, whether or not people on the roof can peer into the yards or the windows of the 7th Street abutters. I think we would advocate for the elimination of that roof deck altogether. I don't really see much benefit to that even for the residents. And I guess finally, my comment with respect to cooperation from the abutters, and that seems to be one of the themes tonight, is the abutters should cooperate and let the developer come onto our properties and take measurements. That's all well and good, but I'd like to have some reciprocity. I'd like the developer to cooperate and provide us with things that we've been asking for a while. A scaled grading plan, trash management plan, details on these garage windows, details on the ventilation systems and the impacts on the abutting properties, details on the structure's impacts on the abutting land for the lateral support issue, and getting the soil borings done on their property so we know exactly what we're dealing with in terms of soil quality. I think that's a fair trade. If you want to come on to the abutting properties and take measurements, I think it's fair for us to ask the applicant to provide the soil details on their property so we have a better sense of what we're dealing with. Thank you.
I want to make sure that I understood you correctly. Are you saying that the applicant will not and cannot have access unless they trade you this information?
No, I didn't say that. I'm just
Okay.
suggesting that that's a fair compromise.
Okay. I want them to understand what it is you're saying.
I think I'll leave it to the clients to address that. I'm just making the suggestion that I think if you're asking us to cooperate with this, I think it's only fair that we get what I think was reasonable information from the very beginning.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to take a 3-minute break.
Yes, you can time it. Somebody else can.
You can take more than 3 minutes.
I guess I'm going to be interviewed next week by the selectmen. What should I look out for?
They're going to ask you questions about the process that we go through, whether you're happy with it or do you think that there's any changes that should be made to the process. And you're probably going to hint at getting your opinion on this, the new 509 and
Right.
you
I
know,
should be cautious about that.
I don't think you have anything to worry about.
Right.
Just be a little prepared for their
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, that's what I'm asking.
But I don't think you have anything to worry about. You're going to get reappointed.
I don't know, I'm getting on in years.
They won't.
They won't. No. I mean, if you,
You're fine.
Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt.
Did
You're the only architect on the board. So.
Did you get notice, Mark, that you had been?
Yes.
You did.
Yes.
So you're a full member.
I am a full member.
Well, we got to get him the code ring.
Right.
I need the book. Secret signs and all of that.
So do we not know yet whether they appointed another architect?
I haven't heard anything about it.
I thought Ashley told me that they had.
That's what I thought too.
Ashley.
I'm waiting for you to put on
Did you say that
earmuffs.
they had appointed the architect? The selectmen? No. Oh, they did. That's what you meant. Okay. I got it wrong. Okay.
I'm the new member,
You're the new member. Same as the old member.
same as the old one.
Oh, that's right.
Change all the stationery.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. Wow. You're going to be in the newspaper every week.
I know. And I have to change my business cards.
Right.
No, I did not. What, to say zoning board member? No.
I signed it.
You're
You
gonna
want me to
sign
sign it again?
I signed.
Mark signed it too.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Signing the card is optional. It's card optional.
You're gonna give it to Joanna?
Who's on this Thursday? Are you on?
No, I'm not.
Who's on this Thursday?
There's no meeting on Thursday.
No, there's
Nobody?
no meeting.
What does that mean?
Jewish holiday.
Oh, you're right. It's Sukkot. I should know these things.
Even I know that, just, I'm a
Wow.
Unitarian.
Well, that's correct.
I didn't know it was one of those holidays.
My uncle
I totally
used-
forgot.
my uncle used to refer to us as utilarians.
That's actually very funny. It's very clever.
He was good with words.
Very sweet. There she is. Okay.
I guess you're done with Judy?
I guess she's done with us. Okay. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, I'm Carrie Staff. I live at 123 Stone Street and am a direct abutter. I just wanted to address the suggestion that the abutters have not been fully cooperative regarding any kind of survey that's been requested. Back in this, I believe it was in the spring, I don't remember exactly which month, but several months back, we did receive communication from the project team asking us for permission to go onto our properties in order to conduct a tree survey, to survey the size and locations of the trees. And all of the abutters gave permission, except with the exception of one. I provided email addresses to the project team for all of the abutters so that they could contact any of them directly. And all of us agreed, except for one, and then we were told actually it didn't matter because they would be doing some sonar technology, using sonar technology to measure the trees. We have not been contacted about doing a topographical survey, and I assume that we will have equal willingness and agreement. We all want to have accurate and correct data, and so the one holdout who was unwilling to provide permission last time, I think, could be brought around as well. So I just wanted to clarify that that's where that stands, so that we have not received any communication yet about a topographical survey. The other comment that I just wanted to make was about service driveway of some sort. I know that many of the other 40B projects in town do not have a service entry or a service driveway, but I do want to point out that Babcock Street is a very different situation in that there is no parking on either side of the street in front of the building, whereas 40 Center Street, the 40Bs, all three of them on Harvard Street, I believe they all have a lane of parking that could be restricted for certain hours of the day or restricted with single-time use where you get the signs from the town and say that there's no parking for the next 2 days or whatever it is. So Babcock Street is unique in the sense that there is no parking on either side of the street for moving trucks, delivery trucks, telephone equipment, all of that. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Susan Roberts. I live at 69 Green Street, around the corner from the project. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 2. Earlier in June, myself and other town meeting members from Precinct 2 and Precinct 8, about almost 20 of us, met with the developer, Mr. Slater, to talk about the plans that had been submitted at that time. And we were pleased that there seemed to be an interest in changing the design of the project, as well as other aspects as well. Now that we have another iteration, albeit a very nice improvement in terms of design, and I would commend the developer, Mr. Slater, for that. There still seems to be some problems in terms of the density and massing, which we as town meeting members and neighbors in the area remain concerned about, and possibly it seems to me that this would be an appropriate time to have another meeting amongst ourselves with the developer, if that's going to be a possibility. I hope that it is. I also wanted to commend Maria for the very thorough analysis that she did in the summary. It's very helpful, I think, for us to understand, number one, the charge, and also where the present plans differ from the charge. In some ways, I'd like to express some frustration because I feel like this is an iteration, kind of like peeling an onion. You know, it's getting smaller, but we still have a major issue, I think, with the main part of the building, even with Mr. Boehmer's suggestion that part of the building be lopped off in terms of the top floor. I mean, I really think that when you look at this with regard to 120 Babcock, especially, the entire building needs to have a floor lopped off. But I would like Mr. Slater, hopefully, to meet with town meeting members again, and we can talk about that and any other issues as well. Another point that I wanted to mention was in terms of site control. And I would respectfully like to point out that this project was submitted for a permit, comprehensive permit, just days before the town was issued the letter that gave us that moratorium. And so if we're dealing with a project that in fact maybe was incorrectly issued a preliminary letter, maybe in fact this project should be subject to the moratorium. So I'm bringing that to your attention just because I think it may in fact have more of an impact town-wide in terms of whether or not, in fact, that PEL was correctly issued. And if it were not, then it should not be counted as having been timely submitted prior to the moratorium that we are now in until next March. So that, of course, is an issue. Another question that I had, which was not addressed, at least in tonight's presentation, is to ask about the number of affordable units that would be created by the project, which now is reduced in number by approximately 10 units. So that was something that I was hoping we would hear about. And then the final point that I wanted to make was just, again, also sharing some frustration about the timing, because we've been hearing that it was always known that the project was going to change, the design was going to change, and so forth. And so I feel like we had, the go-around with this initial project design that took a long time, and I feel like maybe the timing is going to penalize us, and I would urge the developer to just give us the January 8th that Maria was asking for, and so we have less to worry about, because I feel like we've always known it was going to be changed, and yet there was 3-4 months lost as the town representatives and our consultants reviewed a project that we knew was going to change. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Guy Staff. I'm a resident at 123 Stedman Street, and I'm going to ditto a lot of what has been said to the board so far. And I would ask that the board continue its line of questioning regarding setbacks. I'm grateful for changes on the upper floors. However, those don't impact the footprint of the building. The footprint is where the trees and many of the other impacts are going to be felt. In the last couple of meetings, there was definitive discussion using the number 20 feet. I feel as though, and perhaps I missed something in the presentation, I feel as though tonight there was talk of bumps here and 4 feet here and 3 feet there, and I got lost in it, but I didn't see anything that in my head came up to 20. So I would ask that the board continue that line of questioning and continue that exploration, and that the peer review continue to look at that issue, because I don't feel it's been sufficiently addressed. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Anderson, and I'm a abutter at 119 Stedman Street. And I just want to register my surprise that the building has gone down and up and forward on this lot. And at face value, anyone in the community would appreciate potentially a reduction in size, going from 62 units to 52 units. You know, a 17% reduction, that sounds like a compromise. But when you look at the square footage of this building, it is reduced by 3.37%. And I don't see that as compromise, not even close. Barely the skin of an onion, one layer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jody Manasevit, 119 Stedman Street, abutter. The business about the setbacks, the planning board and numerous ZBA members, and I believe Mr. Bomer recommended 20-foot setbacks, and on the three sides. And the section of wall on the rear setback for Stedman Street, one section has actually been slightly reduced, which happens to be behind my house, which is going to be now 10 feet 6 feet, so 10 feet 6 inches. And one of the things, aside from the obvious reason why we would want a greater setback, one of the trees which is on their property is an enormous, probably 150 feet tall old oak. And the root system of that tree I'm not an arborist, but so I can't say how far it's going to go out, but it's going to go out really far. When that tree is taken out, it's going to destabilize the other trees, which are on, some of which are on our property, and some of which are on the developer's property. But those roots also affect our hill. So all of this business about the elevations and I don't understand how you can propose a 52 unit building that's the width of 6 houses and not have taken into account the change in elevation. And they keep talking about the change in elevation, but I keep seeing pictures that don't demonstrate the change in elevation. It's not accurate. It's not accurate visually. And it's not accurate in terms of the destabilization of the hill and then the foundations of our property. And it seems to me that if you need to put up retaining walls on 3 sides of a building because the building's only this far from the adjoining properties, there's something wrong with that. And it seems like all of those things would be kind of like the preliminary planning of a building this size, which is monstrously enormous. And I'm incensed, and basically I'm also insulted Sam Slater and Peter and Jeff Engler. I'm really insulted that you presented this plan after sitting in our house and telling us how you cared about how this was going to affect us, because you clearly do not care. We're going to be looking at a monstrosity. We're losing our privacy. We're going to be listening to car lift bullshit and air conditioner things on the top of the building. And it's absolutely outrageous and unacceptable and morally bankrupt. And I think you should be ashamed of yourselves.
Sir.
Hi, my name is John Harris. I live on Osborne Road, which is, I think 2 or 3 blocks north of the building in question, but I walk by the building in question all the time, and several of the abutters are friends of mine. I've seen how they've been very upset by this whole process and by the prospect of the building as planned even now. I definitely think in terms of the issue of setbacks that the front setback should match that on 120 Babcock. I think the balance should be 20-foot setbacks on the sides and the rear, just to be considerate for the neighbors and to not have too much massing over kind of overarching everybody's house around. I would preserve as many of the existing trees as possible. Very concerned about the root system that has been mentioned before. The trees both on site and the abutters trees, which are very, very important, especially those trees in the Stedman Street because of the visibility aspect there, given the fact that they've got that serious slope down in their backyard. I agree with the idea that's been mentioned of lopping off the 5th floor, basically just to conform, to be more friendly with the neighbors in the area. And I also very much like Sue Roberts' ideas of having another meeting, ideally with Mr. Slater and town meeting members in the adjacent neighborhood. And I hope that could be arranged very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Okay.
I've got one question.
Sure.
Is this going to go into 2018?
Is this a trick question?
No, I need to know.
Is it going to go into 2018? I think there is a reasonable chance that it will go into 2018.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I want to call on the applicant if they want to offer a response to the testimony that they've heard so far this evening. Mr. Allen, Mr. Angler?
I think our testimony is that we understand that there's certainly still issues remaining with the design of this building. We recognize that. It was made clear to us at the last working group, and we never represented to the town during that time that this was take it or leave it, and we plan to continue to work on this plan. I do feel a few of the characterizations, without going to huge lengths, are unfair. A trash plan is not typically done until the end of a process because the footprint is changing, parking is changing, different things that affect the size of the room and things of that nature are changing. And until that's set, it's inefficient and a waste of time to do that. Likewise, I don't think we've had discussion about borings or structural considerations on any 40B we've had in the town of Brookline. Not one, and those are all similar buildings. We're going to have to meet the building code, and whether it's spread footings or piles or what have you, those are all considerations, and we'll have to adhere to that. But to say we haven't thought about that is just not an accurate characterization. So we understand that there are additional details to follow, or they're required. Cliff has asked for some. Dan, on behalf of the neighbors, has asked for some. I would suggest that our need for the survey, some of the additional information will fall out of that, and I would also suggest that that survey probably could be done next week. Some of the things that he's requesting relative to boring information and whatnot will take longer than that, so I don't know about this quid pro quo. I mean, we will endeavor to provide some of the additional information that's outstanding, but I think it's important, and I appreciate Maria stepping in to try to facilitate that. I think everybody's screamed from the rooftops tonight the need for better survey work, And we are certainly committed to doing that, and hopefully we have the cooperation of the neighbors. I never represented earlier that the neighbors were uncooperative. I think I said quite clearly that many of them affirmatively responded. 2 said no. So hopefully we can have, unanimity this time. I understand it's their right to say yes or no, and I would never dispute that. So that's a long-winded way of saying we understand there's work to be done. We will continue to do that work. And we will work in good faith with the town on this process, this public hearing process, which will be consistent with every 40B I've been involved with in the town, of which there have been many. We've never had an issue on any project other than one night on one hearing where we talked a client into being more agreeable. We've never had one issue about timing. And also, it's also not a fair representation. Yes, we're deep into the process, but let's not forget several months were lost through no fault of our own or our clients. Okay, so we understand time is important, and we will endeavor to do that, and some of these things take time to provide this detail. Lastly, I have to comment on this, the ventilation of the garage. There was 44 parking spaces, open air, and there's all these aspersions and allegations that the ventilation of this garage is somehow going to contaminate and pollute the area. We could have the worst ventilation system, and it would still be better what the existing condition is when we're completed. And don't take my word for it, take the peer review consultant's word for it. We have fewer cars with ventilation as opposed to 44 cars with none. So let's just try to be a little bit reasonable. I understand there's criticism and critique, and some things are unsettling and unhappy, and I understand that and respect that. But certain things are, I think, less fodder for some of the criticism. But we will endeavor to provide an updated iteration to Mr. Bomer and the town ASAP. We look forward at the next hearing. We think now the traffic consultants, now that the driveway location and the driveway is not changing, to have both the parking and the interior circulation and traffic all peer reviewed as well. So we look forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just state briefly. My intention is not to get into a discussion about things pertaining to parking and traffic. It's a deliberate intention. And the reason is because we will have another hearing in which there will be a dedicated review of those things. So I don't want to get off topic. So I saw your hand. I'm not trying to.
I'll save the comments for next time, and there was something
Please.
the last time related to that point
Right.
of view that was offered, so thank you.
Sure. Okay. Just as we've done at the end of, I believe, the last 2 hearings, I want now to have, I want the board to have a discussion. Our charge is to review the good, the bad, the indifferent, and hopefully be able to give the applicant and the applicant's team some direction in terms of next steps. So, who wants to jump in first? Kate?
Well, actually, I'm going to start with a question for Mr. Bomer because I'd like your answer on it. In terms of the rear, that's the focus of a lot of concern, given foundation, given the retaining walls, possible harm to neighbors' property and trees. There, as you know, we've been discussing today a whole host of issues that come up relating to the rear yard, especially, with the grade and going into the neighbors. My untutored opinion is that it would ease a lot of these problems if the setback were 20 to 30 yards. And I wanted to know if you had any feet. Well, yards would be even better, but feet. And I'd like to know what your opinion is on that. Oh, as well as affecting the view of the building from the Stedman and Manchester neighbors. I'll say that as well.
Well, I think the developer has certainly heard that that's something they should study. So I completely agree with that it should be carefully looked at. The points that I was making are more just kind of analytical, preservation of trees. I think that point about losing trees destabilizing the hillside, that's real. I mean, that needs to be talked about, thought about. The thing that, and I'm not saying I don't think it should be greater, but I do think that we're back to that setback and height of building ratio again, that currently that's the lowest part of the building. I do think that the impact will be decreased even though it is the lowest, if it were pushed back further. But to me, it's not arbitrary. There isn't a number that's the right number when it's devoid of information, support for it. So I think it should be studied. I think for me, and I think for the neighbors as well, that effective, which I would think this would be something that they could talk about together, would be the screening of the effective screening that might involve trees that aren't on the subject property. They may be existing trees on the neighbor's property.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're in the discussion phase, not the...
That's correct.
Well, so I still think that it's necessary to have wider setbacks all around, so I'd like to see what you guys think as well. And I think at least 20 feet, as we've been saying, and the planning board has been saying since the beginning, would be a minimum. The one side on which I don't have as much of a problem is the south side where the building faces, is it, what number, 120? Babcock. But, I really like Cliff's ideas in terms of lowering the L part of the building. I do like the changes made in terms of the appearance of the building. I think that's great. I'm actually quite happy with that. Okay, let me see what else. Oh, so going into one of Cliff's points, which is making always about the relationship between setback and height and massing, I still, I think that supports the idea that right now the massing is just too intense and too dense for the property. It shouldn't, it's still a situation where a lot of building is taking up almost 100% of the property. And that's something which concerns me. What else? I'm sorry that I'm being a little disorganized. Oh, and as Cliff was saying, increasing the setback also allows for providing a landscape plan that is meaningful. I think that on the north side as well, there's insufficient room to have much screening, and I think that a greater setback would improve that. And the deck, I'm kind of interested to see what you guys think. I think for the neighbors, it creates more problems than it solves because of noise that can be generated by that. So I think that open space should come in a different way. It shouldn't come via a deck. It should come about by increases in setbacks and creating an area for the residents to congregate on the lawn. Right now, that is all I have.
Okay. Mr. Hussey?
No comment.
You don't have any discussion at this time?
Get me out of here.
I think you'd like to go home.
Mr. Zero.
All right. I'm going to sum it up very quickly. First, I want to thank the developer for redesigning the building. It no longer looks like an industrial building, and so I compliment you on the change of design. My only other comment focuses on the size of the building. I believe that the setback should be higher. The height should be lower. With that will come a density reduction. I understand that. We do need to see more information on trees, landscaping. on topography, lateral support, on the loading zone issue was, since there is no loading zone or anymore, how that's going to be managed in terms of moving trucks and service trucks. But I think that the developer has indicated a willingness to work on those things, and I'd like to see those iterations come to fruition. I understand the concerns of the neighbors. One of the illustrations in the new plans, looking directly from Stedman Street between two houses up at the building it's so inaccurately portrayed because it doesn't really show the scale of the building. So hopefully that'll be worked out in new iterations, and I'm looking forward to seeing a new iteration.
Yes, I will say a few things. The business of the moving in and out, they're going to have to park, on the street like they do every place else in Brookline. Same with trash pickup. But there is room on the site to store the trash instead of on the tree lawn on the property, just inside the lot line. So I think that's all right. Setbacks don't really bother me much. I think getting rid of that fifth floor on the end is probably not a bad idea. That'll reduce the massing. I understand all the reasons why the architect has bent over backwards in the stylistic issues. But I think it's a funny building, quite frankly, architecturally. It looks like it was designed by a committee for committee purposes. But I don't see any changes possible. People seem to think it's improvement, maybe so, but I think it's a funny building
tell us.
architecturally.
Be
No,
specific.
no, I don't think so. There's an architect, there's a board, there are neighbors, they've all weighed in.
Well, all except you.
All except me. I mean, the styles and architecture materials is a very personal issue, as we've talked about. And
Okay. Let me start with the good. I actually like the redesign. It's more of a classical reason. You're laughing. I live in a building that looks like this.
oh no, you don't, Jesse. It's quite different.
Well, I
Anyway.
live in what this is based on.
Right.
How's that? So I think it's an improvement. I think it's an improvement because if you look at it from the distance and the perspective view through the park, it looks more appropriate to the neighborhood. The front, and in particular, I like the effort that has been made to break up the components, both horizontally as well as with roof lines and with more traditional windows, and breaking up each specific section. And I think it actually achieves making what is an extremely large building have a better appearance. That's the good. I think that in the front yard, it should match 120 Babcock Street in terms of the setback. I think that was the charge, and frankly, in looking at the view that Peter showed us from both sides of Babcock Street, although it is not a large amount of square feet pulling it in, and I don't know what the impact is on your building, though I'm sure you do, I think it does make a difference. I think it makes a difference in terms of what it is you can represent in the front of the building in terms of landscaped area. So I think it makes a difference. Secondly, I am less concerned with the height in the front, and I've said that before. I don't find it overwhelmingly tall in the front, particularly with how they've now articulated it. The side yard setback, on either side, frankly, I'm less concerned with. The rear yard setback, what will be important for me will in particularly be what we get real time from this topographical survey. But my gut tells me that what my conclusion will be from that information is that that rear yard setback needs to be increased. I don't know how much. I don't know if it needs to be 20 feet, 20 yards. But my gut instinct is it needs to be pulled in. I think the bigger issue.
Is the height.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the bigger issue is the height. And Cliff, to his credit, helped me think through what was bothering me. So when I sort of was talking about that roof that ran across the back, that's what Cliff's talking about.
Yeah.
That's exactly the issue. And he's right. If you lower the building at that wing, that's correct, that wing, and the mansard is 1 story lower, I think that it makes an enormous, enormous difference. Whether or not once you do that a deck is appropriate or inappropriate, I'm not prepared to say yet. I think there's a balancing there. The balance is between the negative impact on the neighbors versus the benefit to the people who will be your neighbors in this building. We have lots of buildings in this town where there are decks. So I don't want to weigh in on that issue yet. But I do think that by sort of moving that lower level further toward Babcock Street, that you'll be able to make a better determination about whether a deck makes sense and what that balance is. What have I missed? I made my comment about issues pertaining to parking and traffic. I think that, as we've commented in I think the last and the prior hearing, they've worked on the ratio. I think the ratio gets even better when you start to deal with these other issues. You know, if you remove the top floor further back, then your ratio with parking gets a little better. So I think it all works together. I think that's it. So my sense from the comments that we have is that the charge from the ZBA is to look at following Cliff's advice, moving that rear section further in, basically making from the L, make that 3 stories with mansard that matches the leveling, increase the setback in the front. Right, so that it is lined.
20 feet isn't that what the setback is along the streetscape?
14.5.
Well, there's a modal front yard setback pattern for most of Babcock, but the 120 Babcock itself isn't, that building doesn't have a 20-foot setback. I think it's more like 14 and a half.
And again, I'm holding off on comment about what to do with a full setback in the rear because I want to see what the data is. So those are, I think, the comments at this point. Anything else to add?
Well, actually, there's one suggestion I have, which was really unpopular last time, which is to have a parking demand analysis done. It may be moot depending on what happens in terms of adjustments to the building, because I personally would be satisfied by a 1-on-1 ratio. But as Mr. Stadig, if that's how you pronounce it, pointed out, you have to look at the parking issue holistically and what's going to be basically need to be put on the street. So you're displacing, 41 cars? And 44 cars, and you'll have 41 underground. So in terms of the Babcock context of who's going to need parking, you really have a mini flood there. So I think he's right in saying, as he did in his written recommendation as well as when he was giving testimony that to fully understand what is necessary for this area, a parking demand needs to be done, unless you just want to increase the parking, which would also work.
Yeah, I think Mr. stated, and I do have in my notes, that he wanted to understand how the displaced parking at 120 Babcock would be accommodated, how it would be dealt with. And just keep in mind that we still do need to hear a response from the applicant in regard to the things that the traffic peer reviewers have raised. That is forthcoming. Clearly, that's for another hearing, and that will come. With the stackers, I will consult with Mr. Static. He might request particular information so that he can further evaluate that. Just clear on the foundation, maybe you'd like to ask Mr. Bomer, because Mr. Bomer actually did ask for some consideration of the foundation method, and I wasn't sure by Mr. Engler's testimony if there was going to be some preliminary thought given to that. I think it would be really helpful to understand the adequacy of the setback in the rear if we could have some insight into the foundation method.
Can you define foundation method for me?
Well, that's why you might like to consult with Mr. Bomer, because the suggestion did come from him.
Mr. Bomer, what exactly is a foundation method?
I think we're back to talking about setback, and my observations along the backyards from Stedman Street is there's a variety of conditions back there. There's no consistent, there's not a big retaining wall that goes all the way across. It's a large variety, and the grade's not the same across either. So my point more than anything else was just wanting to know what site structures are in place so that you would know once you build your building whether you're imposing any load on any of those structures that could in any way degrade existing pieces that are either right on the property line or just off the property line. And the reason it's back setback is that the way you look at there's a zone of influence that's created by a foundation, and it's easy to diagram that, but you need to know what is influenced by that zone of influence, which is the load coming down from the building. Anyway, the reason it's related to setback is that the further away you are, it's a pretty simple calculation to figure out that zone of influence. It might go well below any of the existing structures. It may not impact anything.
So to put it very simplistically, the greater the setback, the lower the stress potentially on the neighboring properties?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, that's the
This is going to have
case.
to be resolved during the design phase by the structural engineer in any event.
Oh, absolutely, but I think that
So it's really, Mr. Engler's right, it's really immaterial to this
I don't
discussion.
agree.
Well, I'm not
Because
sure either.
I think one of the reasons it's really important, Chris, is because one of the things we have to analyze is the safety of a building. And we can't fully make a decision on that unless we know that it's not going to have a negative impact on the neighbors.
Well, then you're going to have to get into the whole building code issue.
Well, except
Do a
I don't
complete
think,
building code report.
I don't think
You got a wooden
that,
structure, and there's all this talk about fire hazard from the wooden structure. Are you going to mandate that they build it out of steel and concrete?
I think that, I mean, to put a fine point on, or I hope it's not making it muddier, but I'll try to put a fine point on it. I'm not suggesting in any way that they need to retain a structural engineer at this point. I know they're very close to needing geotechnical borings. They can't design the structure of the building until they have geotechnical borings and know what they're bearing on. What I'm lacking an adequate understanding of is what is all the stuff that's out there, and even simple understanding those grades and drawing zone of influence diagrams from the foundation. You don't need an engineer for that. Architects can do that with a reasonable degree of accuracy. That's all. I'm not looking for
the topographical survey. Doesn't start there. Isn't that the information?
The topographical survey and also existing conditions,
Yeah.
Right.
what structures
Right,
are on a
including
budget.
the trees.
So
Yeah.
if we can get that information, that will help this discussion. And we're in the process of trying to get that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else?
What's the date of the next hearing?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me. So our next hearing date is November 6th, again, 7 PM. Mr. Engler?
I just want to be prepared because I've got a little bit of conflicting information relative to what we're doing at the next hearing. Clearly, design and the next iteration is first and foremost, but should we encourage our traffic consultant to have interaction with the town's peer-reviewed traffic consultant, parking, and should he come prepared at the next hearing to make a presentation, or are we going to kick parking and traffic out one more hearing beyond the presumed design discussion at the next one?
So this, I'm sorry.
Let me take one step back. So you've heard comments from the board, okay? Is there anything that the board has told you that you feel that as of this point, the applicant is absolutely taking the position cannot be done?
Anything that anyone has said, or, I mean, that's
The
kind
board,
of...
the board.
Well, respectfully, I think Ms. Poverman has said a couple things that we might not be willing to do, but in general, I think the primary charges are something that we are going to take a long look at, and I would
Okay,
endeavor to
so-
say that I think we can do
Okay,
hopefully
so
a
for
lot of them.
clarity's sake,
Yes,
in the front yard,
yes,
running at the same front yard setback as 120 Babcock Street, that's one.
yes,
Two, in the rear, pulling back, lowering the building, okay, as Mr. Bomer has suggested. Okay,
By a floor.
by a floor.
yeah, are you asking me to say yes or no?
No,
Oh, yeah,
no.
no, I think
I
we're...
want an,
Mr. Chairman, I think we're clear on what the directives are from the board, design-wise, so I don't think we need to rehash that. I think my question, so if I could put it in a different context, I don't think those changes are going to materially impact the traffic and parking discussion, other than maybe improving the parking ratio. So it goes back to my question of whether or not the board wants to have those discussions at the next hearing, or whether we want to push them out one more.
I'd like to have those discussions at the next hearing.
Right, so what we need to discuss, Jeff, is there is going to be some outstanding information that you need to provide. We should just look at an internal schedule regarding what you need to supply to the traffic and parking peer reviewers, so they would be able to provide a report. I'd like to give them 2 weeks prior to their testimony, so it
Sure.
would be 2 weeks prior to November 6th. Okay? And some of the other things, I would like to have testimony from Pat Maloney, who is the Chief of Environmental Health, about the traffic plan, the trash plan. So that's something that I'd like to see a narrative, something in writing that he can respond to more formally to the ZBA for the next hearing.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's something we'll be prepared to provide, because I think, albeit maybe some minor tweaks, but I think we're comfortable relative to the size of the trash room, number of barrels. It's all going to be privately managed, so I will say this, of all the other 40Bs, Mr. Maloney has ultimately been satisfied with the plans. They've adhered to everything he's asked for. I would expect this project to be no different.
Okay, do we need extensions?
So a couple of things. First, I do need to have our peer reviewers look at where they are in the budget, just because I think we have had Mr. Bomer attend an extra hearing that wasn't planned, and this wasn't his final report. So I just want to point out that I will need, before I schedule any other staff meetings with Mr. Ballmer or any other peer reviewers, we should take a look at that, and I hope you're willing to consider.
I think Mr. Boehmer's hourly rates are outrageous. We definitively will not pay him any more money, so, no, that's fine. We understand it's part of the process.
Okay. The other thing is that one of the things that Mr. Boehmer has put in his list is about a landscape plan. I don't know how far you can get into it, but something that seems credible, something that is supplied by a landscape architect so that we can understand. Again, part of that mitigation is going to be vegetative screening, and we would need a landscape architect to say that your plan is going to better conserve the existing. I think we need some assurance about that.
We understand. We
Okay.
understand.
All right. Okay.
Time. Where are we? Timeline.
So
Do we
with the
need-
timing, I did a schedule. That is why I came up with a proposed extension to January, which is, there's not a lot of fat in this schedule, even for a January. And I have it here. I have also interim dates, what has to happen between hearings to justify it. Clearly, extending the hearing to November 24th is not enough time. And there are also holidays, which I'm not adding extra time. I'm actually skipping around all of the holidays to make it work. I still would like to ask for an extension until January 11th, 2018.
If we could do it till January 9th, because I'm leaving the country. On the
I
11th.
just wanted to the 11th just to have that.
Oh, so it's
That
not
doesn't mean
scheduled
we're
meeting
meeting on the
and stuff.
11th.
Uh-oh, we got Mr. Allen.
No, it's, we'll discuss that at the November 24th. We won't extend it this particular time. Let me just explain one of the reasons. I have a pretty good sense of timing in the town. I think it's important to continue the process. You heard some of the neighbors talk tonight about the timing. Sometimes in town, come December, nothing happens till the middle of January. It actually doesn't even start in December because town meeting in November, and then there's holidays. And, we get it. And I think to date, we've given you every extension you requested. Might not have been the same time, but we've always extended. And we'll continue to extend that courtesy. So we'll talk about that internally, and we'll be back. Probably talk to Maria before the 24th. But for now, we're on for the 6th, and the extension's still the 24th.
Okay. Okay, any other questions, Mr. Hussey? No. Anybody else? No. Okay. I want to thank everyone for their testimony. And again, our next hearing is November 6th, 7 p.m. Anybody want to make a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
A second? I second.